Chapter 1. The Serpent's Discovery. Harry could have stayed in Gryffindor Tower. It would have been the sensible thing to do, curled up in the common room with Ron's chess set and Hermione's endless questions about homework they'd barely been assigned. But the questions that kept him awake at night weren't about transfiguration theory or the proper wand movement for Wingardium Leviosa. The castle corridors felt different at night. Not empty. Hogwarts was never truly empty, but hushed in a way that made every footstep sound like an accusation. Harry pulled his father's invisibility cloak tighter around his shoulders and paused at the library's entrance. The doors stood slightly ajar, which struck him as odd. Madame Pince was notoriously particular about locking up. He slipped through the gap, careful not to let the door creak. The library stretched before him in pools of moonlight and shadow, familiar book spines transformed into something almost predatory in the darkness. The restricted section waited behind its rope barrier, and Harry felt that familiar tug of curiosity mixed with dread. Information about his parents felt like it should be freely available to him, but the wizarding world seemed determined to treat his own history like classified material. The rope lifted easily over his head. Harry moved between the shelves, reading spine after spine of books whose titles promised knowledge he wasn't supposed to have. Secrets of the Darkest Art, Magic Moster Evil, The Unforgivable Curses, A History. None of these would tell him what James Potter's laugh sounded like, or whether Lily Evans had been nervous on her first day at Hogwarts. A soft thud from deeper in the restricted section made Harry freeze. Someone else was here. He crept forward, wand drawn, though he wasn't sure what spell he'd use if discovered. The sound had come from behind the last shelf, where the oldest grimoires were kept. Harry peered around the corner and nearly gasped. A girl sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open books and scattered parchment. Her blonde hair caught the moonlight streaming through the high windows, and she was writing furiously with a quill that scratched too loudly in the silence. She looked familiar. Slytherin, from his year, though he couldn't remember her name. He'd seen her in potions, always sitting with Pansy Parkinson's group, but never quite part of their constant chatter. She looked up suddenly, as if sensing his presence, and Harry found himself staring into sharp blue eyes that went wide with surprise. "Potter?" she whispered. Harry lowered his wand, feeling foolish. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone else was—" "Shh!" She gestured frantically for him to come closer. "Do you want Filch to find us both?" As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of footsteps echoed from the main library. Heavy, deliberate steps that could only belong to the caretaker making his rounds. The girl, Harry was fairly certain her name was Daphne something, scrambled to gather her books. Harry looked around desperately for a hiding place. "Here!" Daphne hissed, pointing to a gap between two massive bookcases. "Quickly!" They squeezed into the narrow space together. Harry's invisibility cloak spread awkwardly over both of them. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by Mrs. Norris's distinctive padding gait. Harry held his breath and tried to ignore how he could smell Daphne's shampoo, something floral that reminded him uncomfortably of the Dursleys' garden. "I know you're in here," Filch's voice drifted from the main library. "Peeves mentioned seeing lights where there shouldn't be lights." Daphne pressed further back against the shelf, and Harry felt, rather than saw her, wince as something jabbed into her spine. One of the books behind her gave a protesting groan, and then the entire shelf shuddered. A heavy grimoire, disturbed from its resting place, tumbled down between them. Harry caught it instinctively, but the binding was old and loose. The book fell open in his hands, yellowed pages fluttering in the moonlight. Daphne leaned forward to help steady it, and they both froze. There, written in formal script across two facing pages, were their names: Harry James Potter and Daphne Astoria Greengrass. The words seemed to shimmer slightly, as though written in more than mere ink. Below their names, Dense paragraphs of formal language filled the pages, interspersed with magical symbols that pulsed with a faint golden light. "What is this?" Harry breathed. Daphne's face had gone very pale. "It's a marriage contract." The footsteps were fading now. Filch apparently satisfied that the restricted section was empty. But neither Harry nor Daphne moved. They stared at the book between them, reading the same impossible words over and over. "By the sacred bonds of blood and magic," Daphne read softly, "do James Harold Potter and Cyrus Greengrass bind their houses in alliance. The firstborn son of Potter, line to wed the firstborn daughter of Greengrass line, when both reach their majority." "This can't be real," Harry said, though even as he spoke, he could feel something stirring in his chest, a warm, pulling sensation that seemed to respond to Daphne's presence. "It's real," Daphne whispered. She touched the page gently, and the golden symbols flared brighter. "I can feel the magic in it. This is old binding magic, Potter. The kind that—" She swallowed hard. "The kind that can't be broken." Harry stared at her, really looked at her for the first time. Daphne Greengrass, he remembered now. She sat 2 seats behind him in Transfiguration. Never spoke unless Professor McGonagall called on her directly, but always knew the answers, always immaculately put together in a way that suggested she'd never had to think about whether her clothes fit properly or whether there would be enough food at breakfast. "Why was this hidden in here?" he asked. "I don't know." Daphne was scanning the other pages now, her finger tracing lines of text. "But look at the date, Potter. This was signed in 1980. Before—" She glanced at him with something that might have been sympathy. "Before your parents died." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. Dumbledore would know about this. "Everyone would know about this," Daphne said quietly. "Marriage contracts aren't secrets. They're announcements. When 2 old families make an alliance like this, it's published in the Prophet, registered with the ministry. There are ceremonies, negotiations." She trailed off, staring at the contract with a frown. Unless someone went to great lengths to hide it. The warm, pulling sensation in Harry's chest was getting stronger. He had the strangest urge to reach out and touch Daphne's hand, to see if the golden symbols would respond to their skin, touching the way they'd responded to her touch on the page. "We need to research this," Daphne said, closing the book carefully. "Find out what it means, why it was hidden, whether—" She met his eyes. "Whether we have any choice in the matter." Harry nodded, though part of him wondered if choice was really what he was worried about. Daphne Greengrass was nothing like what he'd expected from a Slytherin. She was methodical where he was impulsive, careful where he was reckless. But she'd been in the restricted section too, looking for answers to questions she wasn't supposed to ask. "Tomorrow night," he said. "There's an empty classroom on the 5th floor. The one with the broken window. I know it." Daphne tucked the grimoire into her robes. "Bring anything you can find about marriage contracts or the Greengrass family. I'll see what I can learn about your parents' alliances during the war." They crept out of the restricted section together, Harry's cloak stretched between them. At the library doors they paused. "Greengrass," Harry said quietly. "Daphne," she corrected. "If we're bound by ancient magic, I suppose you might as well use my given name." Harry almost smiled. "Daphne. How do you feel about this?" She considered the question seriously, which Harry was beginning to realize was how Daphne Greengrass considered everything. "I feel like my life was just turned upside down," she said finally. "But I also feel like I'd rather figure out what that means with someone who's asking the same questions I am." She slipped out of the cloak and into the corridor, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. Harry watched her disappear around the corner, before making his own way back to Gryffindor Tower, the memory of golden light and warm certainty still humming under his skin. Whatever this marriage contract meant, whatever choice they did or didn't have, one thing was clear. His life at Hogwarts had just become considerably more complicated. And for the first time since arriving at the castle, Harry found he didn't entirely mind. Chapter 2. Ancient Bonds and Hidden Truths. The abandoned classroom on the 5th floor smelled of dust and neglect, with a broken window that let in more autumn chill than light. Harry had arrived early, partly from nerves and partly because he'd given up on sleeping after the 3rd time he'd woken from dreams filled with golden symbols and blue eyes. He'd spread his notes across one of the intact desks, a pathetically small collection of information gathered from Hogwarts: A History and a few other books Hermione had recommended when he'd asked vague questions about wizarding traditions. The door opened precisely at the agreed time. Daphne slipped inside, carrying a leather satchel that looked expensive enough to buy the Dursleys' house, and Harry felt that same strange pull in his chest that had kept him awake most of the night. "Potter," she said, then caught herself. "Harry." His name sounded different in her careful pronunciation, like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. "Did you bring it?" he asked. Instead of answering, Daphne set her satchel on the desk next to his meager pile of books and withdrew the grimoire. Even in daylight, the ancient binding seemed to shimmer with barely contained magic. She handled it like it might bite her. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Marriage contracts aren't toys, Harry. They're serious magical bindings that can shape entire family lines for generations. The fact that one exists between our families." She trailed off, running her fingers along the book's edge without quite touching it. "What does that mean, exactly?" Harry asked. "I know it says we're supposed to marry when we come of age, but what does that actually entail? Can we refuse? Can it be broken?" Daphne's laugh held no humor. "You really don't know anything about wizarding lore, do you?" "Should I?" The question came out sharper than Harry intended. "It's not like anyone's been queuing up to teach me about pure-blood politics." Something in his tone made Daphne pause. She studied his face with those unsettling blue eyes, and Harry had the uncomfortable sensation that she was seeing more than he'd intended to show. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I forget sometimes that you weren't raised in this world." She opened the grimoire carefully, the pages falling naturally to the contract. "Let me explain what I know." The golden symbols began to pulse gently as soon as the book was open, responding to their proximity in a way that made Harry's skin tingle. Daphne spread her own notes beside the contract, pages of neat handwriting that put Harry's scrawled research to shame. "Marriage contracts like this one are ancient magic," she began, her finger tracing the formal script without touching the parchment itself. "They're not just legal documents. They're magical bindings that connect two magical signatures permanently. Once signed by the heads of both families, they can't be dissolved except by mutual agreement of the contracted parties themselves, and only after they've reached their majority." "So we could refuse it," Harry said, though even as he spoke, he felt that warm pull in his chest grow stronger. "Theoretically." Daphne's expression was carefully neutral. "But there are complications. Look here." She pointed to a section of dense script near the bottom of the contract. "These are the binding clauses. They specify that both parties will be drawn to each other, that their magic will recognize the connection, that attempts to form romantic attachments with others will feel wrong." Harry stared at the text, trying to parse the formal language. "It forces us to love each other?" "No." Daphne's voice was firm. "Love can't be forced, even with magic. But attraction can be enhanced. Compatibility can be emphasized. The contract doesn't create feelings, but it amplifies ones that might naturally develop. She reached for the contract to point out another clause, and her fingers brushed against Harry's hand where it rested on the desk. The moment their skin touched, the golden symbols flared brilliant white, and Harry felt a jolt of warmth race up his arm and settle somewhere behind his ribs. Daphne gasped, jerking her hand back, but the damage was done. The symbols continued to glow softly, and Harry could feel something fundamental shift in the air between them. "That wasn't supposed to happen," Daphne whispered. "What wasn't?" "The binding recognition. It shouldn't activate until we're both of age." She stared at the contract with something approaching alarm. Unless what?" Daphne turned to one of her books, a thick volume titled Ancient Magical Law and Precedent, and flipped through it rapidly. Unless the contract was designed with specific activation conditions. Look, here it is. In cases where contracted parties are exposed to life-threatening danger, the protective elements of the binding may manifest early to ensure the preservation of the bloodline alliance. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. Life-threatening danger? What danger? "I don't know," Daphne said, but her voice was troubled. "But someone thought we might be in enough danger to include emergency protective clauses, and those clauses just activated." They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the contract that seemed to pulse gently with their shared heartbeats. Harry found himself studying Daphne's face, the way she worried her lower lip when she was thinking, the small scar on her chin that he'd never noticed before, the determined set of her shoulders even when she was clearly unsettled. "There's something else," Daphne said eventually. "The date on this contract, 1980. That means it was signed before you were famous, before anyone knew about the prophecy or Voldemort targeting your family. So why would your father and mine make an alliance? What were they preparing for?" Harry pulled out a piece of parchment where he'd copied down everything he could remember about his parents. It wasn't much, just scraps of information from Hagrid and Professor McGonagall. "McGonagall told me my parents fought against Voldemort, that they were in some kind of organization that opposed him." "The Order of the Phoenix," Daphne said. "My father mentioned it once, though he claimed our family stayed neutral. But if your father approached mine with a marriage contract..." She frowned, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. "Harry, I think your father was trying to secure allies, to bring neutral pureblood families over to the light side. By offering me as some kind of political bargaining chip?" The thought made Harry's stomach churn. "By offering his heir as proof of trust," Daphne corrected gently. "Marriage contracts aren't just about the two people getting married. They're about combining magical strength, political influence, financial resources. If the Potter family was willing to bind their heir to the Greengrass family, it would show they trusted us completely." Harry stared at the contract with new eyes. "So this isn't just about us?" "No," Daphne said. "It's about the war that was coming, and the alliances your father thought he needed to win it." She paused, studying his expression. "Harry, if this contract exists, if it was formally signed and registered..." "Dumbledore would know about it," Harry finished. "Everyone would know about it. The Ministry keeps records of all pure-blood marriage contracts. They're matters of public record, published in the Daily Prophet when they're signed." Daphne's voice grew quiet. "But I've never heard of a Potter-Greengrass alliance. My father never mentioned it, and you obviously had no idea it existed." The implications hung heavy between them. If the contract was real, and the magical response they'd both felt suggested it was, then someone with significant power and influence had gone to great lengths to hide it. "Dumbledore," Harry said again, and the name felt like a stone in his mouth. "It would have to be," Daphne agreed. "He's the only one with enough influence to suppress something like this. But why? She gathered her notes, organizing them with the same methodical care she'd shown in the library. What possible reason could he have for hiding your father's political alliances? Harry thought about the warm, grandfatherly man who'd welcomed him to Hogwarts, who'd smiled kindly when awarding points to Gryffindor, who'd seemed to know exactly what Harry needed to hear when he'd felt lost and overwhelmed. The idea that Dumbledore had been hiding something this significant felt like a betrayal of trust Harry hadn't realized he'd given. Maybe he thought it would complicate things, Harry said. Maybe he wanted me to have a normal childhood without worrying about arranged marriages and political obligations. Daphne gave him a look that was equal parts sympathy and exasperation. Harry, you're the boy who lived. You were never going to have a normal childhood, and hiding information about your family's alliances doesn't protect you. It leaves you vulnerable. She was right, and Harry hated that she was right. He'd spent his entire life being told what was best for him by adults who seemed to think he couldn't handle the truth. First the Dursleys, who'd hidden his magical heritage, and now apparently Dumbledore, who'd hidden his political one. "So what do we do?" he asked. Yeah, Daphne closed the grimoire carefully, but not before Harry caught another glimpse of those pulsing golden symbols. "We find out what else has been hidden from us. If Dumbledore suppressed one major piece of information about your family, there are probably others. And if we're bound together by ancient magic, I think we have a right to know exactly what we're bound to." She stood, packing her books with the same efficient grace she'd shown in everything else. "Meet me tomorrow night. Same time, same place. I'm going to write to my father, carefully, and see what he'll tell me about 1980. You should try to find out more about the Order of the Phoenix and your parents' role in it." "How am I supposed to do that?" Harry asked. "It's not like I can just ask Dumbledore." "Ask Professor McGonagall," Daphne suggested. She was in the Order, too. She might be willing to share information Dumbledore wouldn't. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Harry, whatever this contract means for our futures, I want you to know I don't blame you for it. And I don't intend to let anyone else decide what it means for us. Not Dumbledore, not our families, not wizarding tradition." She left before Harry could respond, but her words echoed in the empty classroom long after her footsteps had faded. Harry packed up his own notes slowly, his mind racing with questions and possibilities he'd never had to consider before. Whatever this marriage contract meant, whatever his father had intended when he signed it, one thing was becoming clear. Harry Potter's life was more complicated than anyone had bothered to tell him. And for the first time, he was grateful he wouldn't have to figure it out alone. Chapter 3. Questions in the Great Hall. Harry had never paid much attention to the Slytherin table during meals. The Great Hall was large enough that the four houses might as well have been eating in separate rooms, and he'd been content to focus on Ron's running commentary about Quidditch and Hermione's increasingly elaborate study schedules. But as he sat down for breakfast on Wednesday morning, his eyes drifted almost involuntarily toward the green and silver banners. Daphne sat 3 seats down from Draco Malfoy, her blonde hair catching the morning light streaming through the enchanted windows. She was listening politely to Pansy Parkinson's animated chatter, but Harry could see the distraction in the set of her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed silently against her goblet. When she glanced toward the Gryffindor table, just a quick flick of her eyes, Harry felt that familiar, warm pull in his chest. "Harry," Hermione's voice cut through his wandering attention. "I asked if you finished the Transfiguration essay." "What?" "Oh, yeah, mostly." Harry dragged his gaze back to his breakfast, but he could feel Hermione studying him with the same intensity she usually reserved for particularly challenging homework assignments. "You've been distracted lately," she said, cutting her toast into precise triangles. "Ever since Monday night, actually. Did something happen during your detention with Professor McGonagall?" Harry nearly choked on his pumpkin juice. He'd forgotten he'd told Ron and Hermione he had detention to explain his absence from the common room. No, just boring lines. You know how it is. Hermione's tone suggested she didn't entirely believe him, but before she could probe further, Ron slumped into the seat beside Harry with a yawn. "Morning," Ron mumbled through a mouthful of sausage. "Did you see the Chudley Cannons match scores? Brilliant save in the third." His commentary faded into background noise as Harry's attention drifted back toward the Slytherin table. This time, Daphne was looking directly at him, her blue eyes serious and questioning. The contract had mentioned something about enhanced awareness between bound parties, and Harry was beginning to understand what that meant. He could sense her presence like a warm spot in his peripheral vision, could tell when she was tense or thoughtful without even seeing her face. Their silent exchange was interrupted by Draco's voice, carrying clearly across the hall. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, Daphne. You've been acting decidedly odd." Daphne's response was too quiet to hear, but Harry saw the way her jaw tightened, the careful neutrality that settled over her expression, like a mask. Draco continued, his tone taking on the superior drawl Harry had come to loathe. "Mother always said the Greengrass family had excellent judgment about appropriate associations. I'd hate to think that was changing." The implied threat in his words made something sharp twist in Harry's stomach. He gripped his fork tighter, fighting the sudden urge to walk over and hex the smirk off Malfoy's face. The protective instinct felt foreign and overwhelming, far stronger than any annoyance he'd felt during their previous encounters. "Harry," Hermione said sharply, "you're staring." He blinked, realizing that half the Great Hall was probably watching him glare at the Slytherin table. "Sorry, Malfoy's being his usual charming self." "When isn't he?" Ron said through another mouthful of breakfast. "Git thinks he owns the whole school just because his father's got money." Harry nodded absently, but his attention was still fixed on Daphne. She had excused herself from the Slytherin table and was walking toward the entrance hall, her posture perfectly composed, despite the tension Harry could somehow sense beneath her calm exterior. Their eyes met briefly as she passed the Gryffindor table, and she gave him the slightest of nods. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. History of magic was its usual exercise in fighting off sleep, and charms required more concentration than Harry could manage when part of his mind kept drifting to golden symbols and binding magic. It wasn't until potions that afternoon that Harry understood just how complicated his life was about to become. Professor Snape swept into the dungeon classroom with his usual dramatic flair, black robes billowing behind him like storm clouds. "Today you will be brewing a simple boil cure potion," he announced, his cold gaze sweeping over the assembled first years. "The instructions are on the board. You have 1 hour." Harry groaned internally. Potions was already his least favorite class, and partnering with Ron usually meant spending the entire lesson trying to prevent some kind of cauldron-related disaster. But today, Snape had other plans. "Potter," the professor's voice cut across the room like a blade. "You will partner with Miss Greengrass. Longbottom, you're with Weasley." Harry's heart skipped a beat. Across the room, Daphne's carefully neutral expression didn't change, but he saw her fingers tighten slightly on her ingredient bag. The other students began shuffling around to find their assigned partners, and Harry made his way to Daphne's station with what he hoped looked like reluctant resignation rather than anticipation. "Greengrass," he said formally as he set down his cauldron beside hers. "Potter," she replied, but there was the faintest hint of warmth in her voice that Harry doubted anyone else would notice. They worked in silence for the first few minutes, both hyper-aware of Professor Snape's dark presence moving between the workstations. But as they fell into a rhythm, Harry preparing ingredients while Daphne carefully monitored the brewing process, something unexpected happened. They worked well together. Daphne's precise, methodical approach complemented Harry's more intuitive style perfectly. When she reached for the dried nettles, Harry had already measured and chopped them to the exact specifications. When Harry's timing seemed slightly off on adding the porcupine quills, Daphne subtly adjusted the heat under their cauldron without saying a word. "Interesting," Snape's voice drawled suddenly behind them. Harry tensed, expecting criticism or mockery, but the professor's expression was thoughtful rather than hostile. Very interesting indeed. He moved on without another word, leaving Harry and Daphne to exchange confused glances. Around them, other partnerships were struggling with smoking cauldrons and incorrectly colored potions, but their boil cure potion was turning the perfect shade of pink described in the textbook. "How did you know to adjust the heat?" Harry whispered, as they waited for the final simmering period to complete. "I could feel that you were getting anxious about the timing," Daphne murmured back. It seemed like the logical response. Before Harry could ask what she meant by feel, Professor Snape's voice rang out across the dungeon. "Time. Bottling stations are at the front of the room. Leave a sample on my desk before you go." As they carefully ladled their potion into a crystal vial, Harry caught Daphne's sleeve. "Tonight?" he said quietly. "Same place." She nodded once, then gathered her books and left with the other Slytherins. Harry lingered, ostensibly to clean his workstation more thoroughly, but really to process what had just happened. The synchronization between him and Daphne had felt natural, almost instinctive, in a way that had nothing to do with potion skill and everything to do with the magical bond growing stronger between them. "Mr. Potter." Snape's voice made Harry jump. The professor stood beside his desk, examining the vial they'd submitted with an unreadable expression. "Tell me, how long have you known Miss Greengrass?" The question felt like a trap. "I don't, really. We're in the same year, but we've never talked much before today." Snape's black eyes studied Harry with uncomfortable intensity. "And yet you worked together, as if you've been brewing partners for years. Curious." Harry couldn't think of a response that wouldn't sound suspicious, so he settled for a non-committal shrug. After a long moment, Snape turned back to his desk, dismissing Harry with a wave of his hand. The rest of the day passed in a blur of stolen glances across classrooms and careful attempts to act normally around Ron and Hermione. By the time evening came, Harry felt wound tight as a spring, his awareness of Daphne's presence in the castle like a constant hum in the back of his mind. He made it to the abandoned classroom 10 minutes early, but Daphne was already there, seated at their usual desk with the grimoire open before her. In the wand light, the golden symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with Harry's heartbeat. "I've been thinking about what happened in potions," she said without preamble as Harry sat down across from her. "The way we worked together? The way we knew what the other was thinking." Daphne's fingers hovered over the contract pages. "I think the bond is strengthening faster than it should. These protective enchantments your father included. They're not just meant to activate in life-threatening situations. They're meant to help us function as a team." Harry leaned forward, studying the symbols that seemed to grow brighter as they both focused on them. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we need to be more careful. Snape noticed something was different, and if he did, others will too." Daphne pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began sketching a rough map of the castle. "But it also means we might be able to use the bond to our advantage." "How?" "Enhanced awareness works both ways," she explained, marking locations on her map. "If we can sense each other's emotions and thoughts to some degree, we should be able to coordinate without speaking, share information without anyone overhearing." Harry watched her work, noting the precise lines of her sketch and the thoughtful way she considered each detail. "You've been planning this." "I've been planning several things." Daphne set down her quill and met his eyes. "Harry, I think we need to search Dumbledore's office. If he's hiding information about our family's alliance, there might be other documents, letters, records, anything that could explain why he thought suppressing the contract was necessary." The idea made Harry's stomach clench with nervous energy. That's not exactly a simple evening stroll. His office is behind a gargoyle that requires a password, and even if we could get in, he'd know someone had been there. Not if we're careful. Daphne pulled out another book. This one looked like a collection of spells and charms. There are ways to enter warded spaces without triggering alarms, and ways to examine documents without leaving traces. My family's library is quite comprehensive on the subject. Harry stared at her. Your family's library has books about breaking into secured locations? My family's library has books about a great many things, Daphne said dryly. Pure-blood politics can be quite cutthroat when necessary. Knowledge is protection. As they bent over the spellbook together, planning their approach to infiltrating the headmaster's office, Harry found himself studying Daphne's profile in the wand light. The determined set of her jaw, the way she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the small smile that touched her lips when she found a particularly useful spell. "What?" she asked, glancing up to find him watching her. "Nothing," Harry said quickly. This isn't what I expected when I came to Hogwarts. Discovering you're bound by ancient magic to a Slytherin you barely know. Discovering that I have someone I can actually trust with the truth." Daphne's expression softened, and for a moment, the careful neutrality she wore like armor slipped away completely. "Harry, whatever this contract means for our future, I want you to know that I'm choosing to be here. Not because magic is compelling me to, but because I think we're stronger together than apart." The golden symbols pulsed brighter, as if responding to her words, and Harry felt that warm certainty settle in his chest again. Whatever they were walking into, confronting Dumbledore's secrets, navigating house politics, dealing with a magical bond neither of them fully understood, he was grateful he wouldn't be facing it alone. "So," he said, turning back to the spellbook with renewed determination, "when do we break into the headmaster's office?" Chapter 4. The Headmaster's Secrets. Harry had never appreciated just how loudly the castle breathed at night. Every creak of settling stone, every whisper of wind through the corridors seemed amplified in the darkness as he and Daphne made their way toward the gargoyle that guarded Dumbledore's office. The invisibility cloak stretched between them felt gossamer thin, hardly adequate protection for what they were about to attempt. "Acid pops," Daphne whispered to the stone gargoyle, her voice barely audible even in the silence. The gargoyle remained motionless. "Sherbet lemon," Harry tried, remembering McGonagall's mention of Dumbledore's sweet tooth during their first meeting. Nothing. "Cockroach clusters," Daphne suggested with a grimace. The gargoyle sprang aside with a grinding rumble that made both of them freeze, waiting for footsteps or voices that thankfully never came. The spiral staircase rose before them like a challenge, and Harry felt his heart hammering against his ribs as they began to climb. "Remember," Daphne breathed against his ear, "we touch nothing except what we absolutely must. The detection charms I found should mask our presence, but only if we're careful." Harry nodded, though she probably couldn't see the gesture beneath the cloak. As they reached the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs, Daphne pulled out her wand and began tracing complex patterns in the air. Faint silver threads appeared in the wake of her movements, weaving themselves around the door's handle and lock. "Alohomora Maxima," she whispered, followed by 2 other incantations Harry didn't recognize. The lock clicked softly, and she pushed the door open just wide enough for them to slip through. Dumbledore's office was darker than Harry had expected, lit only by the dying embers in the grate and the faint glow from various magical instruments scattered throughout the room. The portraits of former headmasters dozed in their frames, and Fawkes the Phoenix ruffled his feathers sleepily from his perch near the window. "There!" Daphne pointed toward a cabinet behind Dumbledore's desk, its dark wood carved with protective runes that seemed to shift and writhe in the shadows. "That's warded more heavily than anything else in the room." They crept forward, and Harry felt the warm pull of their bond strengthen as they moved deeper into the space. Daphne's presence beside him was reassuring in a way that had nothing to do with her obvious magical skill, and everything to do with the growing certainty that whatever they found, they would face it together. The cabinet stood nearly 7 feet tall, its doors sealed with what looked like golden wire that pulsed with magical energy. Daphne studied the warding for several long minutes, her fingers tracing the air above the protective spells without quite touching them. "This is dark arts detection magic," she murmured, her voice troubled. "Why would Dumbledore need to protect documents from dark arts unless—" She trailed off, her eyes widening with understanding. Unless what? Unless he's hiding things that would register as dark if discovered. Manipulative magic, coercive charms, binding spells used without consent. Daphne's voice was grim. "Harry, if I'm right about this, what we're about to find might be worse than just a hidden marriage contract." She began working on the cabinet's protections, her wand movements precise and confident, in a way that reminded Harry she'd been raised in a world where such knowledge was considered necessary for survival. The golden wires began to unravel, dissolving into sparkles of light that faded into nothing. The cabinet doors swung open to reveal dozens of files, each neatly labelled and organised with the methodical care Harry had come to associate with Dumbledore's attention to detail. But it was the section marked Potter, Harry, Placement and Development that made Harry's blood run cold. Daphne reached for the file with hands that trembled slightly, and together they opened it on Dumbledore's desk. The first document was a letter dated November 1st, 1981, the day after Harry's parents died. "Hagrid," Harry read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "I trust you will place the boy with his relatives, as discussed. It is imperative that he grows up away from the wizarding world's influence until such time as his training can begin properly. The protective wards I have placed will ensure his safety, but more importantly, they will ensure his isolation." Daphne turned to the next document, a ministry memo about the Potter Greengrass marriage contract. Harry's stomach dropped as he read Dumbledore's response. The marriage alliance must be suppressed indefinitely. The boy's emotional attachments must remain controllable if he is to fulfill his intended purpose. I have spoken with both families and convinced them that secrecy is paramount for their children's safety. Controllable, Daphne repeated, her voice flat with shock. He wanted to keep your emotional attachments controllable. Harry felt sick. The grandfather figure he'd trusted, who'd welcomed him to Hogwarts with such apparent warmth, had been planning his life like pieces on a chessboard. Keep reading. The next file contained correspondence spanning 10 years, each document revealing another layer of manipulation. Letters to Petunia Dursley containing subtle compulsion charms to ensure Harry's continued mistreatment. Payments to ministry officials to suppress information about the Potter family's political alliances. Discussions about necessary hardships to shape Harry's character in the desired direction. "Listen to this," Daphne said, her voice sharp with anger. She read from a letter dated July 1991. "The boy must remain grateful for any kindness shown to him, as gratitude breeds loyalty. His placement with the Dursleys, while regrettable, serves this purpose well. By the time he reaches Hogwarts, he will be so starved for acceptance and belonging that he will attach himself to any adult who shows him genuine care." The words hit Harry like physical blows. Every moment of loneliness, every night spent locked in his cupboard, every cruel word from the Dursleys, all of it had been deliberately orchestrated to break him down and rebuild him as Dumbledore saw fit. "There's more," Daphne whispered. She'd found another section labelled Future Development Plans. The documents inside outlined a careful strategy of controlled revelations, manufactured crises designed to forge Harry into a weapon against Voldemort. Even his friendships were discussed in terms of their usefulness for keeping him emotionally stable but ultimately isolated. Harry stared at a particular passage that made his vision blur with rage. The boy must be kept from forming deep romantic attachments until such time as those attachments can be used to motivate his final sacrifice. The Greengrass contract had posed a significant threat to this timeline, as it would have provided him with unconditional support and political protection that could interfere with necessary character development. "He planned to let you die," Daphne said, her voice hollow with shock. "All of this, everything he did to you. It was to make sure you'd be willing to sacrifice yourself when the time came." The sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase froze them both. Dumbledore was returning, and they were trapped in his office, with the evidence of his manipulation spread across his desk. "Quickly!" Daphne hissed, gathering documents with desperate speed, while Harry struggled to process what they'd learned. She shoved several of the most damning letters into her robes just as the door handle began to turn. Harry threw the invisibility cloak over both of them and pressed them back against the wall behind the door, praying that Dumbledore wouldn't notice the cabinet standing open or the files that were undoubtedly still scattered on his desk. Albus Dumbledore entered his office with the tired gait of a man carrying heavy burdens. His usually twinkling eyes were cold and calculating as they swept the room, taking in details that would have escaped anyone else's notice. He paused at his desk, his fingers hovering over the files they hadn't had time to properly organize. "Curious," he murmured to himself. "Very curious indeed." Harry held his breath, feeling Daphne's hand grip his arm so tightly it would probably leave bruises. The bond between them hummed with shared terror and determination, their hearts beating so loudly Harry was certain Dumbledore would hear them. The headmaster moved to the open cabinet, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "It seems I have visitors who are far more resourceful than I anticipated." He closed the cabinet doors with a gesture, the golden protective wires reappearing instantly. How very educational. He turned toward the area where they stood hidden, and for one terrifying moment Harry thought they'd been discovered. But Dumbledore's gaze passed over them without recognition, settling instead on Fawkes. "What do you think, my dear Phoenix?" Dumbledore asked conversationally. "Should I be impressed or concerned that someone has finally developed enough skill to breach these particular defenses?" Fawkes trilled softly, a sound that somehow managed to convey both warning and sorrow. "Yes," Dumbledore agreed. "I rather suspect things are going to become quite complicated very soon. Perhaps it's time to accelerate certain plans." He settled into his chair and began writing, his quill scratching across parchment with quick, decisive strokes. Harry and Daphne remained frozen against the wall, not daring to move until they were certain he was fully absorbed in his work. When Dumbledore finally rose and walked to the fireplace, taking a pinch of flue powder, they saw their chance. The moment green flames engulfed the headmaster and he disappeared into the network, they bolted for the door. They ran through the corridors without speaking, the invisibility cloak billowing behind them like wings. It wasn't until they reached the abandoned classroom that had become their sanctuary that either of them dared to breathe normally again. "We have to get word to someone," Daphne said, pulling the stolen documents from her robes with shaking hands. "The Ministry, the Board of Governors, anyone who can stop this." "Who would believe us?" Harry asked, though even as he spoke, he knew she was right. "We're 11 years old, and he's Albus Dumbledore. People trust him." "People trusted him because they thought he had their best interests at heart," Daphne corrected fiercely. "But this proves he's been manipulating far more than just your life, Harry. Look at this letter. He mentions other students, other families he's guided for the greater good. This is about more than just you." Harry stared at the evidence of his manipulation spread across the desk, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. The grateful, trusting boy who'd been so desperate for acceptance was gone, replaced by someone harder and more aware of the world's capacity for betrayal. "What do we do?" he asked. Daphne's eyes met his, and he saw his own determination reflected there. "We find allies. Real ones, not people who've been placed in our lives to serve someone else's agenda. And we make sure that marriage contract is activated and recognized before Dumbledore can find another way to suppress it. You still want to honor it, after everything we've learned?" "I want to choose it," Daphne said firmly. "There's a difference between being manipulated into something and deciding for yourself that it's what you want. And right now, Harry, I can't think of anyone I'd rather have bound to me by magic than someone who's willing to break into the headmaster's office to uncover the truth. The golden symbols on the marriage contract, visible through the grimoire's pages, pulsed brighter than ever before. Harry reached out and took Daphne's hand, feeling the warmth of their bond settle into something deeper and more permanent. Whatever Dumbledore had planned for him, whatever sacrifice the headmaster thought was necessary for the greater good, Harry had no intention of playing along. He had allies now, real ones, and a future that was his own to choose. The game had changed entirely, and Harry Potter was no longer content to be anyone's pawn. Chapter 5. Blood and Betrayal. Daphne's letter to her father was 3 pages of careful, precise questions that danced around outright accusations while making her demands for answers perfectly clear. Harry watched her seal it with wax and her family's signet ring, noting the way her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the Greengrass crest into the warm wax. "He'll come," she said, though she sounded more worried than certain. "The moment he reads this, he'll know we've discovered something significant. Father doesn't ignore threats to the family's reputation." They'd sent the letter with one of the school owls just after breakfast, and by early afternoon, a response had arrived requesting an immediate meeting in the Hogwarts grounds. Harry felt a knot of nervous energy in his stomach as they made their way to the designated spot, a secluded area near the Black Lake, where the ancient trees provided cover from prying eyes. Lord Cyrus Greengrass was not what Harry had expected. He'd imagined someone like Lucius Malfoy, cold, aristocratic, dismissive of anyone beneath his social station. Instead, the man who emerged from behind a cluster of oak trees looked genuinely concerned, his weathered face creased with worry lines that spoke of years spent protecting his family from dangers Harry couldn't yet comprehend. "Daphne," he said, his voice warm with affection, even as his eyes remained cautious. "You look well, though your letter suggests you've been asking questions that could prove dangerous." "Father," Daphne replied, her formal tone at odds with the relief Harry could sense through their bond. "Thank you for coming. I believe you know Harry Potter." Lord Greengrass turned his attention to Harry, studying him with the same careful assessment Harry had seen Daphne use when evaluating a particularly complex problem. "Mr. Potter, you have your father's eyes, but your mother's expression when you're thinking through something complicated." "You knew them?" Harry asked, surprised by the personal observation. "I knew them both, though briefly." Lord Greengrass gestured for them to sit on a fallen log that provided a natural bench overlooking the lake. "Your letter, Daphne, mentioned a marriage contract. I assume you've discovered the document your mother and I hoped would remain hidden until you both came of age." "We've discovered considerably more than that," Daphne said, pulling the stolen documents from Dumbledore's office out of her bag. "We know Dumbledore has been manipulating Harry's life since he was a baby. We know you and James Potter made an alliance, and we know that alliance was deliberately suppressed. What we don't know is why." Lord Greengrass's expression darkened as he recognized the ministry letterhead on several of the documents. "Where did you get these?" "Dumbledore's private files," Harry said, watching the older man's face carefully. "He's been planning my entire life, like I'm some kind of weapon he's forging. The marriage contract was apparently an inconvenient obstacle to his plans." "Dear Merlin," Lord Greengrass breathed, reading through Dumbledore's correspondence with growing horror. "I never imagined the scope of his manipulation was this extensive." He set the documents aside and looked directly at Harry. "Mr. Potter, Harry, I owe you an explanation that is 10 years overdue." The older man stood and walked to the water's edge, his posture suggesting he was gathering memories that were painful to revisit. "In the spring of 1980, your father came to me with a proposal that was both politically brilliant and personally desperate. The war against Voldemort was escalating, and James believed that the light side needed to secure alliances with neutral pure-blood families before they were forced to choose sides. The Greengrass family was neutral? Harry asked. Officially, yes. We had business interests that required maintaining relationships with families on both sides of the conflict. But privately, your father's arguments were compelling. Lord Greengrass returned to sit beside them, his expression grave. Voldemort's vision of magical supremacy left no room for families like mine. Old, respected, but not fanatically devoted to his cause. James convinced me that neutrality was ultimately impossible. We would have to choose, and choosing the wrong side would mean the destruction of everything my ancestors had built. Daphne leaned forward, her attention completely focused on her father's words. So the marriage contract was a political alliance. It was insurance, Lord Greengrass corrected. James offered to bind our families not just politically, but magically. If the worst happened, if he and Lily died fighting Voldemort, his son would still have protection through our alliance. And if we were targeted for supporting the light, your children would have the Potter name and magical legacy to shield them. Harry felt something twist in his chest as he began to understand. My father was planning for the possibility that he might not survive the war. Your father was planning for the certainty that the war would cost more than anyone was prepared to lose, Lord Greengrass said quietly. The marriage contract included protective enchantments, political safeguards, and financial provisions that would have ensured both families survived whatever came next. But Dumbledore convinced you to hide it, Daphne said, her voice edged with anger. Lord Greengrass nodded, his expression pained. After your parents died, Harry, Dumbledore approached me with what seemed like reasonable concerns. He said the contract would make you a target, that Voldemort's supporters would see the alliance as proof that the Greengrass family had betrayed the neutral stance they'd maintained during the war. He convinced me that hiding the contract would protect both families until you were old enough to understand and defend yourselves. And you believed him? Harry's voice was sharper than he'd intended. I believed in his reputation for wisdom and his genuine concern for your welfare, Lord Greengrass replied. But reading these documents now, I see that his motivations were far more complex than he led me to believe. Daphne was studying her father with the same analytical intensity Harry had come to recognize. Father, what haven't you told us? There's something else. I can see it in your face. Lord Greengrass was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the dark waters of the lake. Your family has been watching over Harry from a distance for the past 10 years, he said finally. The protective enchantments in the marriage contract don't require activation to function at a basic level. We've been monitoring his situation with the Dursleys. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. You knew how they were treating me? We knew enough to be concerned, Lord Greengrass said carefully. But Dumbledore insisted that Harry's placement with his relatives was magically necessary, that removing him from their care would strip away protective wards that kept him safe from Voldemort's remaining followers. That's not true, Harry said flatly. We found correspondence about those wards in Dumbledore's files. They were designed to keep me isolated and grateful, not safe. Lord Greengrass closed his eyes, and Harry saw the weight of 10 years of second-guessing settle across his shoulders. Then I have failed in my obligation to your father's memory, and I have failed both of you. You were manipulated, Daphne said fiercely, just like everyone else. The question now is what we do about it. Her father looked at the documents scattered between them, then at his daughter and Harry sitting side by side with the unconscious unity that spoke of their growing bond. The first thing we do is ensure this marriage contract is properly registered and activated. If Dumbledore has been suppressing your rights for a decade, he's violated several serious magical laws in the process. And then? Harry asked. Then we give you the choice your fathers intended you to have, Lord Greengrass said. The contract binds your families, but it doesn't compel your feelings. If you choose to honor it, you'll have the full support and protection of both our houses. If you choose to dissolve it when you come of age, that choice will also be honored." Harry looked at Daphne, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her blue eyes. The bond between them hummed with shared understanding, and he realized that the choice had already been made, somewhere deeper than conscious decision. "I want to honor it," Harry said, "not because magic is compelling me to, but because I choose to trust what my father saw in your family. And because," he met Daphne's gaze directly, "because I can't imagine facing whatever comes next without someone I know I can trust completely." "I choose it too," Daphne said, her voice steady with conviction. "But I want it activated properly, with full legal recognition. No more hiding, no more suppression. If we're going to be bound together, I want the entire wizarding world to know that Harry Potter has allies who can't be intimidated or manipulated." Lord Greengrass smiled for the first time since arriving, and Harry saw where Daphne had inherited her quiet strength. "Then we shall ensure the Ministry registers the contract tomorrow. I'll also be filing formal complaints about Dumbledore's unauthorized suppression of legal documents and his interference in family affairs." "Will that be enough to stop him?" Harry asked. "It will be enough to limit his options," Lord Greengrass replied. "And it will send a clear message that the Greengrass family will not tolerate further manipulation of either of our children." As they gathered the documents and prepared to return to the castle, Harry felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his place in the wizarding world. He wasn't just the boy who lived anymore. He was a Potter, with all the political weight and magical legacy that name carried, and soon he would be formally bound to one of the most respected pure-blood families in Britain. "Father," Daphne said as they reached the edge of the grounds, "why didn't you fight harder to protect Harry when you suspected something was wrong?" Lord Greengrass stopped walking, his expression heavy with regret. "Because I let fear override judgment. I was afraid that challenging Dumbledore directly would bring unwanted attention to our family. I chose political safety over moral obligation, and that choice has haunted me for 10 years. He looked directly at Harry. "I cannot undo the failures of the past decade, but I give you my word that from this moment forward, the Greengrass family will stand with you openly. Whatever battles you face, whatever challenges come your way, you will not face them alone." Harry felt the warm certainty of their bond settle deeper into his chest as Daphne's hand found his. For the first time since learning the truth about Dumbledore's manipulations, he felt something that might have been hope. The game was far from over, but at least now he was playing with allies who had chosen his side for reasons that had nothing to do with manipulation or control, and perhaps that would be enough to change everything. Chapter 6. The Weight of Choices. The astronomy tower was deserted at this hour, its circular room open to the night sky and the cool September air that carried the scent of approaching autumn. Harry had suggested meeting here after dinner, partly for the privacy it offered, and partly because something about the open space felt appropriate for the conversation they needed to have. Daphne sat on the stone ledge that ringed the tower's observation deck, her legs dangling over the edge as she studied the stars with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. The moonlight caught the silver threads in her school robes and turned her hair into spun platinum, and Harry found himself staring longer than was probably appropriate. "My father left this afternoon," she said without looking at him. "He's filing the contract registration papers tomorrow morning, and by tomorrow evening the entire wizarding world will know about the Potter-Greengrass alliance." "Are you having second thoughts?" Harry asked, settling beside her on the ledge. Their shoulders almost touched, and he could feel that warm pull of their bond humming between them. "I'm having all the thoughts," Daphne admitted with a wry smile, "about what this means for our futures, about whether we're making this choice for the right reasons, about whether anyone will ever see me as anything more than a political arrangement that became convenient." The vulnerability in her voice made something tighten in Harry's chest. Is that what you're worried about? That people will think you're just fulfilling an obligation? Aren't I? Daphne turned to face him, and in the moonlight her expression was serious and searching. Harry, I've spent my entire life being groomed for exactly this kind of alliance. Pure-blood daughters are taught from childhood that our marriages will be political, that our feelings are secondary to family advancement. How do I know that what I feel for you is real and not just well-trained compliance? Harry had never considered that question from her perspective. His own childhood had been marked by isolation and neglect, not careful preparation for political usefulness. "What do you feel for me?" he asked quietly. Daphne was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the stone between them. "I feel like I can breathe properly when you're around," she said finally. "Like I don't have to perform being the perfect, pure-blood daughter every moment of every day. When we're together, I can just be Daphne, not Daphne Greengrass of the Sacred 28, not a political asset, just me. And that feels like compliance." "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "That feels like the first genuine thing I've ever experienced. But how do I know the difference between what I actually want and what I've been taught to want? How do I know that choosing this isn't just following the script I was raised with?" Harry reached out and took her hand, feeling the familiar spark of warmth when their skin touched. "Because you're questioning it. If you were just following a script, you wouldn't be worried about whether your feelings were real. You'd just accept them and move on." Daphne's fingers curled around his, and she gave him a look that was equal parts gratitude and exasperation. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Harry said. "Nothing about this is simple. But maybe that's the point." He shifted closer, their knees bumping together. "Daphne, I spent 11 years thinking I was worthless, because that's what the Dursleys told me every day. Then I came to Hogwarts, and everyone expected me to be some kind of hero because of something I can't even remember doing. Now I find out my entire life has been manipulated by someone I trusted." "So how do you know what you actually want?" Daphne asked, echoing her own question. "Because when I'm with you, I'm not the boy who lived, or the nephew who should be grateful for scraps of kindness, or the weapon Dumbledore was forging," Harry said. "I'm just Harry, and just Harry wants to see where this goes, contract or no contract." Daphne studied his face in the moonlight, and Harry felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the quiet intensity of her attention. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that." Harry hesitated, then decided to risk complete honesty. "Daphne, I've never had anyone in my life who chose to be there. Ron and Hermione are great friends, but we were thrown together by circumstance. The Dursleys were stuck with me. Even Hagrid and McGonagall care about me, partly because of who my parents were. But you," he paused, gathering courage. "You could walk away from this. Your father gave us that choice, and you're still here." "I'm still here," Daphne agreed softly. "Not because I have to be, but because I want to be." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Harry became acutely aware of the warmth radiating from Daphne's skin, the way her breathing had gone slightly unsteady, the fact that her lips were close enough to kiss if he just leaned forward a few inches. "Harry," she whispered, and he wasn't sure if it was a question or an invitation or simply his name spoken like a prayer. He leaned closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of silver in her blue eyes, close enough that their breath mingled in the cool night air. Daphne's eyes fluttered closed, and Harry felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he closed the final distance between them. Their first kiss was soft and tentative, a question asked and answered without words. Harry felt the magical bond between them flare with golden warmth, and for a moment the entire world narrowed to the gentle pressure of Daphne's lips against his, and the way her hand tightened in his. "Daphne!" Draco Malfoy's voice cut through the night like a blade, and they sprang apart so quickly that Harry nearly fell off the ledge. "I know you're up here. Crabbe saw you heading toward the astronomy tower." Footsteps on the spiral staircase below gave them perhaps 30 seconds to compose themselves. Daphne smoothed her robes and hair with quick, efficient movements, but Harry could see the flush on her cheeks and the slight tremor in her hands. "Let me handle this," she murmured, and Harry heard steel beneath the quiet words. Draco appeared at the top of the stairs, his pale hair dishevelled and his expression thunderous. He was flanked by Crabbe and Goyle, who looked uncomfortable but determined. His grey eyes swept the tower, taking in Harry's presence with obvious disgust. "There you are," Draco said, his voice carrying that familiar aristocratic drawl. "I've been looking everywhere for you. We need to talk." "Do we?" Daphne's tone was perfectly neutral, but Harry could sense the tension coiled beneath her calm exterior. "Yes, we do." Draco stepped closer, his attention focused entirely on Daphne, as if Harry didn't exist. "The entire Slytherin common room is talking about your recent associations. People are starting to ask questions about your family's loyalties." "My family's loyalties are none of their concern," Daphne replied coolly. "Everything about our house is our concern," Draco snapped, his composure beginning to crack, "especially when one of our own is consorting with Gryffindor blood traitors and undermining everything Slytherin stands for." Harry felt anger surge through him, hot and immediate. "Watch your mouth, Malfoy." "I wasn't talking to you, Potter," Draco said without even glancing in Harry's direction. "Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that you'd corrupt a pure-blood witch with your common influences." "Draco!" Daphne's voice cracked like a whip, and suddenly Harry understood why she'd been sorted into Slytherin. The quiet girl who'd spent weeks being methodical and careful was gone, replaced by someone with steel in her spine and ice in her voice. "You will not speak about Harry that way, and you will not presume to lecture me about my choices." "Your choices affect all of us," Draco shot back. "The Slytherin house has a reputation to maintain, and associations with certain types of wizards reflect poorly on everyone." "Certain types?" Harry stood, his hand automatically moving toward his wand. "You mean people who don't think blood status makes them better than everyone else?" "I mean people who don't understand their place in the proper order of things," Draco snarled, finally turning his attention to Harry. "Though I suppose that's what happens when you're raised by muggles." The contempt in his voice made something snap inside Harry. Before he could think better of it, he had his wand out and pointed directly at Draco's chest. "Take that back." "Harry." Daphne's voice cut through his anger, calm and steady. "He's not worth it." But Draco had his own wand out now, and Crabbe and Goyle were fumbling for theirs. The situation balanced on the edge of violence, with 4 wands and years of house prejudice creating a tension that felt ready to explode. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Draco said, his eyes fixed on Harry's wand. "Gryffindor hot-headedness and complete disregard for consequences. Is this really the type of wizard you want to bind yourself to, Daphne? Someone who can't control his temper?" "Someone who won't let his friends be insulted," Daphne corrected. "Someone who stands up for what he believes in instead of hiding behind family reputation and inherited prejudices." The words hit Draco like physical blows. Harry saw the moment when the older boy realized that Daphne wasn't going to be intimidated or shamed into compliance with his expectations. "You're making a mistake," Draco said, lowering his wand but not putting it away. "This association will cost you everything. Your family's standing, your place in proper wizarding society, your future." "My future is my own to choose," Daphne replied. "And I choose to stand with someone who sees me as a person, not a political asset." She moved to stand beside Harry, close enough that their shoulders touched, and Harry felt the magical bond between them pulse with shared determination. The golden symbols of their contract might not be visible, but their unity was unmistakable. Draco stared at them for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, disbelief, and something that might have been disappointment. "You'll regret this," he said finally. "Both of you." He turned and stalked toward the stairs, Crabbe and Goyle following like confused shadows, but he paused at the top of the staircase and looked back. "Daphne," he said, and for a moment his voice carried genuine concern instead of aristocratic arrogance. "Your family worked for generations to build their reputation. Don't throw it away for a childhood infatuation." "I'm not throwing anything away," Daphne said quietly. "I'm choosing what to build my life around." After they'd gone, Harry and Daphne stood in silence for several minutes, the night air feeling colder and the stars seeming more distant. Harry could feel the aftermath of adrenaline making his hands shake slightly, and he was acutely aware that their first kiss had been interrupted by the exact kind of confrontation they'd both been dreading. "So," he said finally. "That went well." Daphne surprised him by laughing, a sound that was equal parts amusement and hysteria. "Oh yes, brilliantly. Nothing says romantic evening like wand-pointing and threats of social ostracism." "Are you okay?" Harry asked, studying her face for signs of doubt or regret. "I'm terrified," Daphne admitted. "But I'm also certain. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Harry said. "I've been terrified since the moment we found that contract, but I've also never been more sure of anything in my life." Daphne reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with natural ease. Where their skin touched, Harry could feel the magical bond humming with renewed strength, as if their confrontation with Draco had somehow solidified their choice to stand together. "The magical binding is responding," Daphne observed, holding up their joined hands. Around their wrists, faint golden threads had appeared, visible only when they touched, and only in the moonlight. "Is that good or bad?" "It's real," Daphne said simply. "Whatever we choose from here on out, it's going to be together. Are you ready for that?" Harry looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the determined set of her jaw, the warmth in her blue eyes, the way she stood with perfect poise, even after being threatened by people she'd known her entire life. He thought about the choice between duty and desire, between following the path others had laid out and forging something entirely their own. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it completely. The golden threads around their wrists pulsed brighter, as if the magic itself approved of their decision. And for the first time since discovering the marriage contract, Harry felt like they weren't just bound by ancient magic. They were choosing to be bound by something far more powerful. They were choosing each other. Chapter 7. The Serpent and the Lion. The morning of October 1st brought an unseasonably warm Saturday that seemed to invite students out of the castle and into the grounds. Harry and Daphne had planned to spend the afternoon by the Black Lake, continuing their careful research into magical contracts and their legal implications. What they hadn't planned for was Professor McGonagall intercepting them after breakfast with an unusual request. "Mr. Potter, Miss Greengrass," she said, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes holding what might have been sympathy. "I've received word that your families require certain documents to be collected from Gringotts today. As this matter appears to be time-sensitive, I'm granting you both permission to visit Diagon Alley this afternoon." Harry exchanged glances with Daphne, both understanding that this was likely Lord Greengrass's way of ensuring the marriage contract registration was handled properly and publicly. The trip to Diagon Alley would make their alliance visible to the wizarding community in a way that couldn't be hidden or suppressed. "Thank you, Professor," Daphne said. "We'll return before dinner." "See that you do," McGonagall replied, though her stern expression softened slightly. "And be careful. Public attention can be overwhelming." 3 hours later, Harry understood exactly what she'd meant. The moment they'd stepped out of the flue at the Leaky Cauldron, heads had turned and conversations had stuttered to a halt. Harry Potter, The boy who lived walking through Diagon Alley with Daphne Greengrass of the Sacred 28 was apparently the most interesting thing to happen in Wizarding Britain since his defeat of Voldemort. "Is that really him?" whispered a witch with elaborate purple hat feathers. "With a Greengrass girl," murmured her companion. "Isn't she rather young for such associations?" "My dear, they're the same age," the first witch corrected. "But the political implications—" Harry felt his shoulders tense as more whispers followed them down the cobblestone street. Beside him, Daphne maintained perfect poise, acknowledging the stares with cool nods while keeping her hand firmly linked with his. The golden threads around their wrists were invisible beneath their sleeves, but Harry could feel their warmth pulsing steadily. "Ignore them," Daphne murmured, as they approached the white marble steps of Gringotts. "Half of them are just curious, and the other half are trying to figure out what this means for their own political positions." But ignoring the attention became impossible when a woman with elaborately styled blonde hair and jeweled spectacles appeared seemingly out of nowhere, flanked by a photographer whose camera was already flashing. "Mr. Potter," the woman called in a voice that carried clearly across the busy street. "Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet. Might I have a word about your companion today?" Harry felt Daphne's grip tighten on his arm, but before either of them could respond, Skeeter was already talking, her quick quotes quill hovering beside her and scribbling rapidly. "The boy who lived steps out with mysterious Slytherin beauty," she dictated, her eyes gleaming with professional interest. "Young love blooms across house lines in what sources suggest may be a politically motivated alliance." "We have no comment," Harry said firmly, trying to guide Daphne toward the bank's entrance. "Oh, but surely you have something to say about this unexpected partnership," Skeeter pressed, keeping pace with them easily. "Miss Greengrass, your family has maintained strict neutrality in wizarding politics for decades. What changed?" Daphne stopped walking and turned to face the reporter with perfect composure. "What changed, Miss Skeeter, is that some of us have discovered the value of choosing our own paths rather than following the expectations others set for us." "Fascinating." Skeeter's quill scratched faster. "And would these choices have anything to do with certain marriage contracts that have recently been registered with the ministry? Contracts that were apparently suppressed for over a decade?" Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. The registration was supposed to have been handled quietly, but apparently nothing involving the Potter name stayed quiet for long. "Our personal affairs are private," he said, but Skeeter was already speaking again. "Private affairs become public interest when they involve the boy who lived and one of the most prominent pure-blood families in Britain," she said, with a smile that reminded Harry uncomfortably of a shark. "Tell me, Mr. Potter, how long have you and Miss Greengrass been romantically involved? Was this relationship the reason for the recent registration of a marriage contract dated 1980? The photographer's camera flashed again, and Harry saw his and Daphne's joined hands captured in magical film that would undoubtedly appear in tomorrow's newspaper. Around them, a small crowd was gathering, drawn by the commotion and the increasingly obvious presence of a major story breaking. "That's enough," Daphne said, her voice cutting through the noise with Slytherin authority. "We have business to attend to." She guided Harry up the steps of Gringotts with determination that brooked no argument, but Harry could hear Skeeter's voice continuing behind them. "Young love or political maneuvering? The truth behind the Potter-Greengrass alliance revealed exclusively in tomorrow's Daily Prophet." Inside the bank, the cool marble and professional efficiency of the goblins provided blessed relief from the chaos outside. But Harry's mind was racing with the implications of what had just happened. "That was a disaster," he said, as they approached the teller windows. "That was inevitable," Daphne corrected calmly. "Better to have it happen when we were prepared than when we were caught off guard." The business at Gringotts was straightforward, collecting documents that formally recognized their family's alliance and the magical binding that connected them. Lord Greengrass had been thorough in his preparations, and within an hour they had everything they needed to make their partnership legally unassailable. But the damage was already done. By the time they returned to Hogwarts that evening, Rita Skeeter's article was already in circulation through special evening editions of the Daily Prophet, and the entire school was buzzing with speculation and debate. "Love across house lines," the headline screamed, accompanied by the photo of Harry and Daphne holding hands outside Gringotts. "Secret marriage contract reveals decade-long plot to unite boy who lived with Slytherin pureblood." Harry stared at the article in the Great Hall, his appetite completely gone, as he read Skeeter's sensationalized version of events. According to her reporting, their relationship was either a Slytherin plot to manipulate him or a Gryffindor scheme to infiltrate pure-blood society. The truth, that they'd simply chosen each other, was apparently too mundane for her readers. Around them, the Great Hall had divided into clusters of animated discussion. Harry could see students from all four houses gesturing toward the Gryffindor and Slytherin tables, their voices rising as debate turned into argument. "This is ridiculous," Ron said, stabbing his roast beef with unnecessary force. "They're making it sound like you're some kind of political puppet." "Aren't I?" Harry asked quietly, his eyes drifting toward the staff table where Dumbledore sat with his usual calm expression. "Hasn't everyone been trying to use me for their own purposes?" Before anyone could answer, Professor McGonagall approached their table with an expression of grim determination. "Mr. Potter, Miss Greengrass," she said quietly. "The headmaster would like to see you in his office immediately." The walk to Dumbledore's office felt like a march to execution. Students lined the corridors, their whispers following Harry and Daphne like a susurrus of judgment. By the time they reached the gargoyle, Harry's nerves were stretched to their breaking point. "Lemon drops," McGonagall said to the Stone Guardian, and Harry felt a bitter irony that they were using the same password they'd guessed during their break-in. Dumbledore's office felt different this time, less welcoming, more like the stage for a confrontation that had been building for weeks. The headmaster sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled, his blue eyes lacking their usual twinkle. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "I believe we have much to discuss." Harry remained standing, and after a moment, Daphne moved to stand beside him. The gesture of unity wasn't lost on Dumbledore, whose expression grew slightly more troubled. "I see," the headmaster said softly. "You've chosen to present a united front. How very Slytherin of you, Mr. Potter." "Don't," Harry said, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "Don't try to turn this into house politics or some kind of manipulation by Daphne. This is about what you did to my life." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since Harry had known him, the old man looked genuinely weary. "I suppose you've read Miss Skeeter's article?" "We've read your files," Daphne said calmly. "The ones you kept locked in your cabinet. The ones that detail exactly how you've been manipulating Harry's life since he was a baby." Something flickered across Dumbledore's face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation? "I see you are both more resourceful than I anticipated. Tell me, how did you manage to bypass the protective wards on that particular cabinet?" "Does it matter?" Harry demanded. "The point is that we know what you did. We know you suppressed the marriage contract, convinced our families to keep it hidden, and spent 10 years making sure I'd be grateful enough and isolated enough to do whatever you wanted when the time came." "Everything I did," Dumbledore said quietly, "was done to protect you and to ensure the greatest good for the greatest number of people." "You had no right!" The words exploded out of Harry with years of suppressed anger behind them. "You had no right to decide my future, to manipulate my life, to keep me from knowing about my own family's alliances." "I had the responsibility," Dumbledore replied, his voice growing firmer. "The responsibility to ensure that you would be strong enough and motivated enough to face the challenges that await you. The marriage contract would have complicated those preparations considerably." "How?" Daphne's voice cut through Harry's rage like a blade. "How exactly would Harry having a loving family and political allies have complicated your plans? Unless, of course, Your plans required him to be isolated and dependent on your guidance. Dumbledore's eyes sharpened as they focused on Daphne. Miss Greengrass, you are very young to be making such serious accusations. I'm old enough to read, Daphne replied coolly. And your own correspondence makes it clear that you needed Harry to be emotionally vulnerable and politically naive. The marriage contract threatened that, because it would have given him unconditional support and protection that you couldn't control. You don't understand the larger picture, Dumbledore said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining complex magic to first years. The forces at work in our world are far greater than personal happiness or individual choice. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Whose greater good? Harry demanded. Yours? The Wizarding World's? Because it certainly wasn't mine or my parents' good. They made an alliance to protect their children, and you destroyed it to serve your own agenda. Your parents understood the necessity of difficult choices, Dumbledore said. They died for the greater good, Harry. Would you dishonor their sacrifice by pursuing selfish interests? The words hit like a physical blow, but before Harry could respond, Daphne stepped forward. How dare you? She said, her voice deadly quiet. How dare you use his parents' deaths to justify your manipulation? James and Lily Potter died protecting their son, not serving your political machinations. And using their memory to guilt Harry into compliance is beneath even you. Dumbledore blinked, seemingly taken aback by the vehemence in her voice. Miss Greengrass, you are allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. No, Daphne said, moving closer to his desk. I'm seeing your judgment clearly for the first time. You speak of the greater good as if you're the sole arbiter of what that means. You treat people like chess pieces to be moved around your board. And when confronted with evidence of your manipulation, you don't apologize or explain. You condescend and deflect. I have lived longer than either of you, Dumbledore said, his voice growing cold. I have seen more of the world's darkness and made more difficult decisions than you can possibly imagine. My choices have saved more lives than you will ever know. And destroyed how many others? Harry asked. How many people have you manipulated for the greater good? How many families have you separated? How many alliances have you broken? How many lives have you controlled? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying both of them with an expression Harry couldn't read. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, but carried an undertone of warning. You are both very young, he said. Young enough to believe that love and idealism can overcome the realities of power and conflict. I hope for your sakes that you never learn how naive that belief truly is. We're old enough to choose our own path, Harry said firmly, and we choose each other, and we choose to honor the alliance our parents made. If that complicates your plans for the greater good, then perhaps your plans need to change. He stood and moved toward the door, Daphne beside him. But Dumbledore's voice stopped them at the threshold. Mr. Potter, the headmaster said quietly, I hope you will remember that every choice has consequences, and some consequences are more far-reaching than young hearts can anticipate. Harry turned back, meeting those blue eyes that had seemed so kind and wise just weeks ago. I'll remember, he said. I'll remember that you had 10 years to treat me like a person instead of a weapon. And I'll remember that when you finally had the chance to explain yourself, you chose manipulation and guilt instead of honesty and trust. They left without another word, the office door closing behind them with a finality that echoed through the spiral staircase. As they walked back toward their dormitories, Harry felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his place at Hogwarts. The game had changed entirely, and for the first time, Harry Potter was playing by his own rules. Chapter 8. Allies and Enemies. The great hall at breakfast the next morning felt like a battlefield mapped in house colors. Students clustered around copies of the Daily Prophet, their voices rising and falling in waves of argument and speculation. Harry had barely made it through the doors before the stares and whispers started, but this time they felt different, less curious, more divided. "Harry," Hermione's voice was tight with what might have been disapproval as he approached the Gryffindor table. "We need to talk." Ron looked up from his copy of The Prophet with an expression Harry had never seen before, something between confusion and hurt. "Mate," he said slowly, "why didn't you tell us you were involved with a Slytherin?" The way he said Slytherin made it sound like a communicable disease. Harry felt his temper spark as he sat down across from his friends, acutely aware that the entire Gryffindor table had gone quiet to listen. "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this," Harry said, his voice carrying more edge than he'd intended. "Like what?" Ron demanded. "Like your best friends who care about what happens to you. Harry, she's a Slytherin. Her family probably supported you-know-who during the war." "Her family stayed neutral," Harry corrected firmly. "And even if they hadn't, that doesn't determine who Daphne is as a person." "Doesn't it?" Ron's voice was rising now, drawing attention from nearby tables. "All Slytherins are the same, Harry. Dark wizards, the lot of them. She's probably just using you for your fame." "Ron Weasley," Hermione's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through Ron's tirade. "You will not sit here and make judgments about people you don't know based on their house affiliation." Ron stared at her, clearly surprised by her sharp tone. "But Hermione, you can't seriously approve of this. It's Harry we're talking about." "Yes, it is Harry we're talking about," Hermione said, her voice growing calmer, but no less firm. "Harry, who has spent his entire life being told what to do by other people. Harry, who deserves to make his own choices about who he trusts and cares about." She turned to face Harry directly, her brown eyes serious behind her bushy hair. "I'll admit, when I first read the article I was concerned. Not because she's a Slytherin, but because I was worried someone might be taking advantage of you. But then I remembered the way you two work together in classes, and how you've seemed happier these past few weeks." "You have noticed," Harry said quietly, surprised by her observation. "I notice everything," Hermione replied with a small smile. "And I notice that Daphne Greengrass treats you like Harry, not like the boy who lived. If that's what you found with her, then I support you completely." Ron was staring at both of them as if they'd announced plans to join Voldemort for tea. "You can't be serious. She's a Slytherin, Hermione. They're our enemies." "No, Ron," a quiet voice said from beside him. Neville Longbottom, who'd been listening to the conversation while pretending to read his herbology textbook, looked up with surprising determination. "Evil wizards are our enemies. People who hurt innocent people are our enemies. House colors aren't enemies." "Neville?" Harry said, surprised by the support from an unexpected source. "My grandmother has been telling me for years about the political alliances that existed before the war," Neville continued, his voice growing stronger. "The Greengrass family was known for their fairness and their protection of half-blood families who were being targeted. If Harry has found someone from a family like that, someone who chooses to stand with him despite the social pressure," he shrugged. "Maybe that's exactly what he needs." "Thank you," Harry said, meaning it completely. "Besides," Neville added with a shy smile, "adults have been making decisions about our lives without asking us since we were born. It's nice to see someone our age deciding for themselves what they want." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the Slytherin table. Draco Malfoy had stood up, his voice carrying clearly across the Great Hall as he addressed Daphne, who sat at the far end of the table with several empty seats around her. "Blood traitor!" Draco's voice was cold with aristocratic disgust. "That's what you are, Greengrass, a blood traitor who's forgotten everything your family stands for." Daphne looked up from her breakfast with perfect composure, but Harry could feel tension radiating through their bond. "My family stands for honor, Draco. Something you seem to have misunderstood." "Honor?" Draco laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "You call consorting with half-blood Gryffindor's honor? You call betraying your own house honor?" "I call choosing my own path honor," Daphne replied calmly. "I call refusing to let others dictate my choices honor. And I call standing up to bullies like you honor." Several Slytherins nodded in agreement, though they were careful not to let Draco see their approval. But Pansy Parkinson and her usual followers moved closer to Draco, creating a visible division within the house itself. "Your family will disown you for this," Pansy said with malicious satisfaction. "Pure-blood families don't tolerate this kind of betrayal." "My family supports my decision," Daphne said firmly. "As does the Potter family. We have all the alliance and support we need." Harry felt a surge of pride at her calm defiance, but before he could stand to join her, a new voice cut through the tension. "That will be quite enough," Professor McGonagall's stern voice carried easily across the Great Hall. "Mr. Malfoy, return to your seat immediately. Miss Parkinson, 10 points from Slytherin for disrupting breakfast." The deputy headmistress walked deliberately toward the Slytherin table, her tartan robes billowing behind her with impressive authority. But instead of addressing Draco further, she stopped beside Daphne's seat. "Miss Greengrass," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby tables to hear. "I believe you have Transfiguration first period today. Perhaps you'd like to walk with me to discuss your recent practical work. You've shown remarkable improvement in advanced techniques." It was clearly an offer of protection and support, disguised as academic discussion. Daphne smiled gratefully as she gathered her books. "Thank you, Professor. I'd appreciate that very much." As McGonagall and Daphne left the Great Hall together, Harry caught sight of another unexpected reaction. Professor Snape, who'd been watching the entire confrontation from the staff table, met Harry's eyes across the room. The potions master's expression was unreadable, but he gave the slightest of nods before returning to his breakfast. Later that morning, as Harry made his way to potions class, he found Snape waiting for him in the corridor outside the dungeon classroom. "Potter," the professor said in his usual cold tone. "A word." Harry followed him into the empty classroom, wondering if he was about to face detention, or worse, for the disruption at breakfast. "I do not approve of this alliance you've formed," Snape began without preamble. "A Gryffindor and a Slytherin, romance across house lines. It's the sort of foolish sentimentality that leads to poor judgment and dangerous mistakes." Harry felt his temper rise. "Sir, with respect, however," Snape continued, cutting him off, "I find myself impressed by your defiance of certain authorities who have overstepped their bounds." Harry stared at him, certain he'd misheard. "Sir? The suppression of legal marriage contracts, Potter, is a serious violation of wizarding law. The manipulation of family alliances for political gain is the sort of behavior I would expect from Dark Lords, not from supposed leaders of the light." Snape moved closer, his black eyes boring into Harry's with uncomfortable intensity. "I knew your father, Potter. James Potter was many things I despised: arrogant, reckless, showing off at every opportunity. But he was also fiercely loyal to those he chose to protect. If he made an alliance with the Greengrass family, he did so for good reason." "You're saying you support this?" Harry asked, still struggling to process Snape's unexpected position. "I'm saying I support your right to honor your father's commitments and make your own choices, regardless of what certain meddling headmasters believe is best for you," Snape replied. "Miss Greengrass is a competent witch from a respected family. You could do far worse for political allies." Before Harry could respond, Snape had returned to his typical cold demeanor. "Now get to your seat, Potter, and try not to let this newfound alliance affect your potion brewing. I have no intention of lowering my standards." The rest of the day brought a steady stream of reactions from across the school. Some students, particularly those from traditional pure-blood families, seemed scandalized by the cross-house alliance. Others, mostly from families that had suffered during the war, expressed quiet approval for any partnership that might bring political stability. But the reaction that surprised Harry most came that evening, delivered by Owl during dinner. The letter bore the Weasley family seal, and Harry's heart sank as he recognized Mrs. Weasley's handwriting. Dear Harry, I hope this letter finds you well. Ron has written to tell us about the recent developments regarding your alliance with the Greengrass family, and I wanted to share some thoughts. I must admit, my first reaction was concern. As someone who cares about you like a son, I worry about anyone who might try to take advantage of your kind heart and famous name. However, after discussing the matter with Arthur and considering what we know of the Greengrass family, I find my concerns changing. The Greengrass family protected several half-blood families during the darkest days of the war, often at considerable risk to themselves. Lord Greengrass himself provided safe passage for families fleeing Voldemort's persecution, and never asked for payment or recognition. These are not the actions of people motivated by dark intentions. More importantly, Harry, you have spent enough of your young life having decisions made for you by others. If you have found someone who makes you happy, someone you trust and who trusts you in return, then you have my blessing and support. Please know that you are always welcome in our home, and Miss Greengrass would be equally welcome should you choose to bring her for a visit. With love and support, Molly Weasley. P.S. I've enclosed some of your favorite treacle tart. Share it with your young lady if you'd like. Harry read the letter twice, feeling something tight in his chest ease for the first time since the Daily Prophet article had appeared. Mrs. Weasley's acceptance meant more than he'd realized it would. Good news? Daphne asked, settling beside him at their usual spot in the library. The best, Harry said, handing her the letter. We have allies, Daphne, real ones from places I never expected. As she read Mrs. Weasley's words, Daphne's smile grew warm and genuine. She sounds wonderful. I'd like to meet her someday. You will, Harry promised. Once all this settles down, we'll visit the burrow. I think you'll like the chaos there. And I think you'll like the quiet of Greengrass Manor, Daphne replied. My mother is looking forward to meeting you properly. They sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by stacks of books and the gentle sounds of other students studying. The magical bond between them hummed with contentment, and Harry realized that despite all the controversy and conflict, despite the opposition they still faced, he felt more settled than he had since arriving at Hogwarts. He had allies now, unexpected ones from across house lines and political divisions. He had someone who chose to stand with him, not because of his fame or his destiny, but because of who he was as a person. And most importantly, he had the freedom to choose his own path forward. Whatever came next, whatever challenges Dumbledore or Draco or the wider wizarding world might present, Harry and Daphne would face them together. And they wouldn't face them alone. Chapter 9. The Cost of Truth. The ministry officials arrived at Hogwarts on Thursday morning, like a gathering storm, their formal black robes and stern expressions sending whispers through the corridors, as students tried to determine what had brought such an official delegation to the school. Harry first noticed them during Transfiguration, when Professor McGonagall paused mid-sentence, her face paling as she received a message from her enchanted classroom door. Mr. Potter, Miss Greengrass, she said quietly, her voice carefully controlled. You're required in the headmaster's office immediately. The walk to Dumbledore's office felt longer than usual, made more ominous by the presence of 3 ministry officials waiting at the base of the spiral staircase. Harry recognized the lead official from newspaper photographs, Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic himself, flanked by 2 stern-faced wizards, whose badges identified them as members of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. Ah, Mr. Potter, Miss Greengrass, Fudge said with the kind of forced joviality that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for joining us. We have some rather serious matters to discuss. In Dumbledore's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension that had nothing to do with the usual magical instruments and sleeping portraits. Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his blue eyes lacking their customary twinkle. But it was the fourth person in the room who made Harry's stomach drop with dread. Lucius Malfoy stood near the window, his long blonde hair perfectly arranged, and his silver-headed cane resting casually against his leg. When he turned to face them, his grey eyes held a satisfaction that made Harry's skin crawl. "Minister Fudge," Dumbledore said carefully, "perhaps you could explain to Mr. Potter and Miss Greengrass why their presence has been requested." "Certainly, Albus." Fudge cleared his throat and adopted what Harry suspected was his official tone. "The Ministry has received several concerning reports about irregularities in the registration of certain historical documents, specifically a marriage contract between the Potter and Greengrass families that was apparently suppressed for over a decade." "There were no irregularities," Daphne said quietly. "My father filed all the proper paperwork. The contract is legally binding and properly registered." "Ah, but that's where things become complicated, my dear," Fudge replied, his tone patronizing in a way that made Harry's hands clench into fists. "You see, when contracts are suppressed for legitimate safety reasons, as this one apparently was, their sudden reactivation requires additional scrutiny." "What kind of additional scrutiny?" Harry asked, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. Lucius Malfoy stepped forward, his smile cold and predatory. "The kind that examines whether the reactivation serves the best interests of all parties involved, Mr. Potter. The Ministry is concerned that young people might be making decisions they're not mature enough to fully understand." "We understand perfectly," Daphne said, her voice steady, despite the tension Harry could feel radiating from her through their bond. "Do you?" Malfoy's tone grew sharper. "Do you understand, Miss Greengrass, that this alliance has already begun to affect your family's standing in wizarding society? That your father's business relationships are suffering because of his public support for this arrangement?" Harry saw Daphne flinch slightly, and something cold settled in his chest. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about consequences, Mr. Potter," Malfoy replied smoothly. "The Greengrass family has extensive business dealings with other pure-blood families. Families who are concerned about the political implications of this alliance. Several major contracts have already been cancelled, and Lord Greengrass faces significant financial losses if this situation continues." "That's coercion," Harry said flatly. "That's business," Malfoy corrected. "People have the right to choose their associates based on their own principles and concerns. If Lord Greengrass chooses to honor this contract, he must accept the social and financial consequences of that choice." Fudge cleared his throat again. "Which brings us to the Ministry's position. We believe it would be in everyone's best interests if this contract were reconsidered. Given the parties' young age and the significant pressure they're facing, perhaps a period of separation would allow cooler heads to prevail." "You want to dissolve the contract," Daphne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We want to protect you," Fudge replied. "Both of you. From decisions that might have far-reaching consequences you're not prepared to handle." "The way Dumbledore protected me by hiding the contract for 10 years?" Harry asked, his anger beginning to override his shock. Dumbledore spoke for the first time since the officials had arrived. "Harry, I understand you're upset, but—" "No," Harry cut him off. "You don't get to speak about protection anymore. Not after what we found in your files." Malfoy's eyes sharpened with interest. "Files? What files might those be, Mr. Potter?" Harry realized too late that he'd revealed information he shouldn't have. But before he could respond, the office doors opened and Lord Greengrass entered, followed by a woman Harry had never seen before. She was elegant in the way that suggested generations of pure blood breeding, with Daphne's blonde hair and the same careful composure. But her blue eyes held a worry that even her perfect posture couldn't hide. Mother, Daphne said, standing quickly. Lady Greengrass moved to her daughter's side with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous social situations. Daphne, darling, are you all right? I'm fine, Daphne replied, though Harry could see the uncertainty in her eyes as she looked between her parents. Lord Greengrass surveyed the room with cold assessment before addressing Fudge. Minister, I wasn't aware this matter had escalated to requiring official ministry intervention. Nor was I aware that you would be bringing your wife into what should be a private discussion, Fudge replied with slight reproach. When my family is being threatened and my daughter's future is being decided by men in closed rooms, I bring whatever support I deem necessary, Lady Greengrass said coolly. Her voice carried the same steel Harry had heard in Daphne's when she was angry. Malfoy stepped forward again, his expression sympathetic in a way that felt entirely false. Lady Greengrass, surely you understand the position this places your family in, the social implications, the business consequences. Is it really worth risking everything your family has built for a childhood attachment? Lady Greengrass studied Harry for a long moment, and he felt like he was being evaluated for some test he didn't understand. Mr. Potter, she said finally, my daughter speaks very highly of you. But I must ask, are you prepared for the cost this alliance will exact from all of us? The question hit Harry like a physical blow. He looked at Daphne, seeing the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands trembled slightly despite her outward composure. He thought about Lord Greengrass facing financial ruin, about the pressure on their entire family, about the way this alliance was affecting people he was only just learning to care about. No, he said quietly, I'm not prepared for that cost, and I won't ask anyone else to pay it. The room went completely silent. Even Fawkes seemed to stop breathing on his perch near the window. Harry, Daphne said, her voice sharp with panic. The contract requires mutual agreement to dissolve, Harry continued, his voice growing stronger, even as something inside him was breaking. I'm giving you that agreement, Daphne. You're free to walk away from this, free to protect your family without worrying about magical bindings or political obligations. No. Daphne's voice cracked like a whip. No, Harry. You don't get to make that decision for me. I'm not making it for you, Harry said desperately. I'm making it for your family, for your future. You shouldn't have to choose between me and everything you've known. But I am choosing, Daphne said, moving to stand directly in front of him. I'm choosing you, Harry Potter. Not because magic is compelling me, not because our fathers signed a contract, but because I choose to love you. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Lady Greengrass drew in a sharp breath, and Harry felt his heart stop completely. You love me, he whispered. I love you, Daphne said firmly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent office. I love your determination to protect people, even when it costs you everything. I love the way you see me as a person, not a political asset. I love that you're willing to sacrifice your own happiness for my family's safety. And I love you enough to tell every person in this room that I choose you freely, whatever the consequences. The moment the words left her mouth, the magical bond between them flared to brilliant life. Golden threads appeared around both their wrists, visible to everyone in the room, pulsing with warm light that seemed to respond to their heartbeats. The marriage contract itself materialized in the air between them, its ancient symbols glowing with the same golden radiance. Fascinating, Dumbledore murmured, his academic interest momentarily overriding the political tension. The contract is responding to freely given declarations of love. It's strengthening the bond because both parties have chosen it without coercion. Which means it can only be dissolved by mutual agreement, Lord Greengrass said, his voice carrying satisfaction and relief in equal measure. and since both parties have just declared their mutual choice to honor it, the Ministry has no legal grounds to intervene, Lady Greengrass finished, her tone carrying the authority of someone well-versed in magical law. Minister Fudge, I believe this matter is concluded. Malfoy's face had gone pale with fury. This is not over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The consequences of this choice will follow both families for years to come. Then we'll face them together, Daphne said, her hand finding Harry's, as the golden threads around their wrists pulsed brighter. Harry squeezed her fingers, feeling the magical bond settle into something deeper and more permanent than anything he'd ever experienced. Together, he agreed. Fudge looked between the glowing contract, the joined hands, and the determined expressions of two 11-year-olds who had just declared their love in front of the Minister for Magic himself. I see. Well, if the contract is legally binding and both parties consent. They do, Lord Greengrass said firmly, and their families support their choice. Even knowing the cost? Malfoy asked, making one final attempt to sow doubt. Lady Greengrass moved to stand beside her husband and daughter, presenting a united front that reminded Harry powerfully of the way the Weasleys supported each other. Mr. Malfoy, she said with icy politeness, the Greengrass family has survived political upheavals, wars, and social pressures for over 1,000 years. We have always chosen our allies based on character and honor, not on convenience or social advantage. I see no reason to change that tradition now. She turned to Harry with a smile that transformed her entire face. Welcome to the family, Mr. Potter. I look forward to getting to know my future son-in-law properly. As the ministry officials filed out of the office with varying degrees of frustration and resignation, Harry found himself surrounded by the Greengrass family's warmth and protection. The golden threads around his and Daphne's wrists had faded to invisibility again, but he could still feel their presence, a constant reminder that he had chosen his path freely and been chosen in return. So, Daphne said quietly, as they walked back towards their dormitories, her parents having returned to finalize the legal protections that would shield them from further ministry interference. That happened. Which part? Harry asked. The ministry trying to dissolve our contract, your mother accepting me into the family, or you telling a room full of powerful adults that you love me? All of it, Daphne said, with a laugh that sounded slightly hysterical. But especially the love part. Was it terrible timing? Harry stopped walking and pulled her into an alcove where they could have a moment of privacy. Daphne, he said seriously, it was perfect timing. Because I love you too. He kissed her then, soft and certain, and felt the magical bond between them pulse with golden warmth that had nothing to do with ancient contracts and everything to do with the choice they'd made to stand together against whatever came next. Chapter 10. Ancient Magic and Modern Hearts. The library had become their refuge over the past week, a place where Harry and Daphne could work together without the constant weight of stares and whispers from their fellow students. But today they weren't alone. Hermione had joined them with an armload of books that looked older and more dangerous than anything Harry had seen outside the restricted section. Where did you find these? Daphne asked, running her fingers carefully along the spine of a volume titled Matrimonial Magic, Bonds Beyond the Veil. Professor McGonagall, Hermione said, settling into the chair across from them. I asked her about historical marriage magic after what happened yesterday. She said if we're going to be bound by ancient enchantments, we should at least understand what they do. Harry felt a surge of gratitude toward both Hermione and McGonagall. After the confrontation in Dumbledore's office, he'd been wondering what other surprises their magical bond might contain. What have you found so far? Hermione opened the first book to a page marked with several pieces of parchment. The Potter Greengrass contract isn't just a marriage agreement. It's a protection ward written into legal form. Look at this passage. She pointed to a section of dense text that Harry squinted to read. When two magical signatures are bound by blood, intention, and witnessed oath, the resulting connection serves as both alliance and armor. Each party becomes keeper of the other's magical essence, able to draw strength from shared power and provide warning of mortal danger. That explains some things, Daphne said quietly. The way we could sense each other's emotions, how we worked together so well in potions without even discussing our approach. There's more, Hermione continued, turning to another marked page. Matrimonial bonds of this type were typically created during times of war or great danger. The magical protections they provide are specifically designed to keep both parties alive long enough to produce heirs and continue the family line. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. James knew Voldemort was targeting our family specifically. More than that, Daphne said, studying another passage. Listen to this. The bond shall provide mutual resistance to hostile magic, enhanced intuitive awareness, and the ability to channel combined magical strength in moments of extreme peril. Harry, your father wasn't just making a political alliance. He was giving you magical armor. The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. His father hadn't just been thinking about political strategy when he'd signed the marriage contract. He'd been trying to ensure Harry would survive whatever was coming. The bond with Daphne was meant to be a lifeline. That's why Dumbledore was so determined to suppress it, Harry realized. If I had access to enhanced magical protection, if I had someone who could sense when I was in danger, you'd be much harder to control, Hermione finished, and much harder to isolate. They worked in silence for a while, each absorbed in different books and taking notes on what they found. But as the afternoon wore on, Harry began to notice something odd. He could sense Daphne's emotional state more clearly than usual. The focused concentration when she found something interesting, the brief frustration when a passage was too archaic to decipher, the warm contentment that seemed to pulse between them whenever their eyes met. Daphne, he said quietly, not wanting to disturb the other students scattered throughout the library. Can you feel what I'm feeling right now? She looked up from her research, her blue eyes studying his face with that careful attention he'd grown to love. You're curious about something, but also slightly worried. And there's something else. Anticipation? That's exactly what I'm feeling, Harry said. How is that possible? Hermione looked up from her own book with excitement. The bond is strengthening. Look at this section. As trust deepens between bonded parties, the connection evolves from simple awareness to shared experience. Advanced bonds allow for communication without words, shared magical strength, and in rare cases, shared dreams and visions. Shared dreams, Daphne repeated, her voice taking on an odd tone. Harry, have you been having strange dreams lately? Every night since the ministry confrontation, Harry admitted, but they're not nightmares. They're peaceful. I'm in a place I've never seen before, but it feels like home. There's always someone with me, but I can never quite see who. Daphne's eyes went wide. A garden with white roses and a stone bench beside a fountain. And you can hear music playing somewhere inside a manor house, but it's too far away to identify the melody. Harry stared at her in shock. How could you possibly know that? Because I'm having the same dreams, Daphne said. I thought they were just my imagination, but... Harry, I think we're sharing a vision of our future, of what we could build together. Hermione was frantically taking notes. This is incredible. Shared prophetic dreams are mentioned in the literature, but they're supposed to be extremely rare. The bond between you is much stronger than anything I've read about. Is that good or bad? Harry asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The connection with Daphne felt natural and right in a way that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with choice and trust. It's powerful, Hermione said carefully, which means it could be very good or very dangerous, depending on how it's used. Their research was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Snape, who swept into the library with his usual dramatic flair. But instead of his customary sneer, his expression was thoughtful as he approached their table. "Miss Granger, I see you're expanding your studies beyond the standard curriculum," he said, glancing at the books spread around them. "How very ambitious of you." "Professor Snape," Hermione said politely, "we were researching the historical context of matrimonial magic." "Indeed." Snape's black eyes fixed on Harry with uncomfortable intensity. "Mr. Potter, you will join me for an additional potion session this evening. 7 o'clock, Dungeon Classroom 3. Sir." Harry felt a spike of anxiety. "Have I done something wrong?" "On the contrary," Snape replied, "you've done something quite interesting. I wish to observe how your enhanced partnership affects your magical abilities under controlled conditions." After he'd swept away in a billow of black robes, Daphne turned to Harry with concern. That sounded ominous. "Everything Snape says sounds ominous," Harry replied, but he was worried too. "What do you think he means by controlled conditions?" They found out that evening when Harry arrived at the designated dungeon classroom to find it set up like an obstacle course. Cauldrons bubbled at various stations, each requiring different ingredients and techniques. But what caught Harry's attention was the fact that Daphne was already there, looking as surprised as he felt. "Ah, excellent," Snape said as Harry entered. "Both subjects have arrived." "Both subjects?" Daphne asked. "Miss Greengrass, your presence is required to properly test the theoretical protections your bond is supposed to provide. Mr. Potter, you will attempt to brew 3 different potions simultaneously while Miss Greengrass remains at the far end of the room. I wish to see if your enhanced intuitive connection allows for improved magical focus." Harry moved to the first cauldron, acutely aware that Snape was watching his every movement. But as he began preparing ingredients for what looked like a complex healing potion, he found himself falling into the same rhythm he'd experienced when working with Daphne directly. He could sense her presence at the edge of his awareness, a warm steadiness that helped center his concentration. The first potion progressed smoothly, but as Harry moved to the second station, Snape stepped closer. "Interesting. Your magical signature is more stable than usual. Miss Greengrass, what are you experiencing?" "I can feel Harry's concentration," Daphne said, her voice slightly distant. "It's like I'm helping him focus without actually being there." "Fascinating," Snape murmured, making notes on a piece of parchment. "Continue, Potter." The second potion required precise timing and delicate temperature control. Harry had always struggled with the more finicky aspects of potion making, but today his instincts seemed sharper. When he reached for ingredients, his hands moved with confident precision. When the potion needed stirring, he knew exactly how many rotations were required. "Remarkable," Snape said, examining the perfectly amber liquid in Harry's cauldron. "Your technique has improved dramatically since the last class. Now for the third station." The third cauldron contained ingredients for what Harry recognized as a particularly volatile potion, one that could easily explode if the mixing sequence was wrong. As he reached for the powdered moonstone, something felt off. The magical atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, and through his bond with Daphne, he sensed a sharp spike of alarm. "Harry, stop!" Daphne called out, moving toward him instinctively. Harry jerked his hand back just as the moonstone powder began to smoke. A moment later, the cauldron erupted in a shower of sparks and acrid green smoke that would have seriously burned anyone standing directly over it. "Extraordinary," Snape said, his voice carrying what might have been approval. "The protective aspects of your bond are functioning exactly as the ancient texts describe. Miss Greengrass's enhanced awareness allowed her to sense the magical instability before Mr. Potter was harmed." Harry stared at the smoking remains of the cauldron, his heart racing. "You knew that would happen." "I suspected it might," Snape admitted. "The ingredients in that particular combination are designed to react negatively to certain magical signatures. I wanted to test whether your bond would provide adequate warning of magical danger." "You could have seriously hurt him," Daphne accused, her voice sharp with anger. "On the contrary," Snape replied calmly. "I was testing whether he could be hurt while under your protection. The results suggest that your father's precautions were remarkably effective, Mr. Potter. The bond between you provides both offensive enhancement and defensive warning systems." As they cleaned up the classroom, Harry found himself marveling at what had just occurred. The magical connection with Daphne wasn't just emotional or intuitive. It was practical protection that could save his life. "Your father was brilliant," Daphne said quietly as they walked back toward their dormitories. "He created a bond that doesn't just unite two families. It creates a magical partnership that makes both parties stronger." "And harder to kill," Harry added grimly, "which explains why Dumbledore was so determined to suppress it." "But he didn't succeed," Daphne pointed out. "We found each other anyway. Maybe that's what the shared dreams mean. Our magic, recognizing what was always supposed to be." Harry took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of their connection settle into something deeper and more permanent than simple attraction. The golden threads around their wrists remained invisible, but he could feel their presence like a second heartbeat. "I love you," he said quietly, still amazed by how naturally the words came now. "I love you too," Daphne replied. "Magic, politics, and ancient contracts aside, I choose you, Harry Potter." As they reached the point where they had to separate toward their different dormitories, Harry felt the bond between them pulse with warm certainty. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, whatever dangers they might face, they would face them together. And now he understood that together meant more than just emotional support. It meant magical protection that had been crafted by a father's love and activated by their own choice to trust each other completely. The ancient magic that bound them was powerful, but it was the modern choice they'd made to honor it that made them truly unbreakable. Chapter 11. The Headmaster's Gambit. The detention assignment came during lunch on Tuesday, delivered by a first-year Hufflepuff who looked terrified to be approaching the Gryffindor table. Harry read the parchment twice before the words fully registered. "Mr. Potter is to report to Professor Kettleburn for detention this evening at 8 o'clock. Location: forest boundary for observation of nocturnal creature behavior." "The Forbidden Forest!" Hermione's voice rose high enough to carry to nearby tables. "Harry, you can't be serious about going into the Forbidden Forest at night for detention." "I don't have much choice," Harry said, though every instinct he'd developed over the past weeks was screaming that something was wrong. "It's signed by Dumbledore himself." "What did you even do to earn detention?" Ron asked, looking confused. "You've been keeping your head down all week." Harry studied the parchment again, but there was no explanation for what offense had supposedly earned him this punishment. The magical bond with Daphne was humming with unease, and when he looked toward the Slytherin table, he saw her frowning at her own piece of parchment. During the break between transfiguration and charms, Harry intercepted Daphne in the corridor. "Please tell me you didn't get assigned forest detention, too." "No," Daphne said, but her expression was troubled. "I got library duty with Madam Pince, which is strange, because I haven't broken any library rules. But Harry, something feels wrong about this." "Wrong how?" "The magical bond," Daphne said quietly, moving closer so other students wouldn't overhear. "It's been agitated all day, like it's trying to warn me of something. And now you're being sent into the Forbidden Forest alone." "I won't be alone," Harry said, though the reassurance felt hollow. "Professor Kettleburn will be there." "Will he?" Daphne's blue eyes were sharp with concern. "Harry, what if this is another test? What if Dumbledore is trying to create a situation where you need rescuing, so he can swoop in and prove you still need his protection?" The possibility hadn't occurred to Harry, but now that Daphne had voiced it, it felt horribly plausible. "You think he'd actually put me in danger just to prove a point?" "I think he's desperate," Daphne said firmly, "and desperate people do dangerous things." That evening, as Harry made his way toward the forest boundary, the magical bond was practically thrumming with anxiety. Every few steps, he felt the urge to turn around and go back to Gryffindor Tower, but the detention slip was clear. Failure to appear would result in suspension from Hogwarts. Professor Kettleburn was waiting at the edge of the Forbidden Forest with a lantern that cast flickering shadows on the ancient trees. "Ah, Potter," he said cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the ominous atmosphere. "Ready for some practical observation of nocturnal magical creatures?" "Professor," Harry said carefully, "is this detention really necessary? I'm not sure what I did to earn—" "Oh, I'm afraid I won't be joining you tonight after all," Kettleburn interrupted, consulting his pocket watch. "Emergency at the Dragon Reserve, you understand. But Hagrid should be along shortly to supervise. In the meantime, just wait here and keep an eye out for anything unusual." Before Harry could protest, the professor had gathered his things and hurried back toward the castle, leaving Harry alone at the forest edge with only a flickering lantern for company. The minutes stretched on without any sign of Hagrid. The sounds of the Forbidden Forest seemed to grow louder in the darkness. Rustling leaves, distant howls, and other noises Harry preferred not to identify. The magical bond was practically vibrating with alarm now, and he was beginning to seriously consider abandoning detention and heading back to the castle when a new sound froze his blood. Something large was moving through the trees toward him. Something with heavy footsteps and a breathing pattern that suggested it was both predatory and very, very close. Harry raised his wand, his heart hammering, as golden eyes appeared in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. An acromantula, easily the size of a small car, emerged from the forest, with its mandibles clicking in what Harry desperately hoped wasn't anticipation. "Nice spider," Harry said weakly, backing toward the castle while keeping his wand raised. "Good spider. Very large. Terrifying spider who probably doesn't want to eat first-year students." The acromantula took another step forward, and Harry realized with growing panic that his back was now against a stone wall that bordered the forest path. He was trapped, and his first-year spells were unlikely to do much damage to a creature that size. The bond with Daphne suddenly flared with brilliant intensity, and Harry felt her emotions crash into his consciousness. Terror, determination, and an overwhelming need to reach him. Somehow, across the castle grounds, she knew he was in mortal danger. "Help," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to himself, to magic in general, or to the girl whose presence he could feel like a warm spot in his chest. The acromantula raised its front legs, preparing to strike, when the sound of running footsteps echoed across the grounds. But it wasn't just one person. It sounded like a small army. "Harry!" Daphne's voice carried clearly through the night air, followed immediately by other familiar voices. "This way!" Ron shouted. "Lumos Maxima!" Hermione's voice rang out, and brilliant light flooded the forest edge. "There!" Neville called out. The acromantula, startled by the sudden light and noise, reared back just as Daphne burst into the clearing, followed by what looked like half of Hogwarts. Students from multiple houses poured around the forest boundary, wands raised and expressions fierce with protective determination. "Get away from him!" Daphne shouted, her wand pointed directly at the giant spider. But instead of casting a spell, she moved to stand beside Harry, and the moment their hands touched, the magical bond between them exploded into visible golden light. The protective enchantments that had been carefully woven into their marriage contract, activated with spectacular force. Golden threads wrapped around both of them like armor, and the combined power of their magical signatures created a barrier that sent the acromantula scrambling backward into the forest, with chittering sounds of alarm. "Bloody hell," Ron breathed, staring at the display of ancient magic. "You two are glowing." "The bond," Hermione said with academic excitement, despite the danger they'd just faced. "The protective enchantments activated when you were both threatened." But Harry wasn't paying attention to the magical theory. He was focused on the fact that when Daphne had sensed his danger, she'd somehow mobilized students from multiple houses to mount a rescue operation. Gryffindors and Slytherins stood side by side, their previous antagonisms forgotten in the face of shared concern for a fellow student in danger. "How did you know?" he asked Daphne, as the golden light gradually faded. "The bond," she said simply. "I felt your terror, and I knew something was wrong. So I ran to get help." "She burst into the Slytherin common room and told us you were in danger," Draco Malfoy said, his voice oddly subdued. "When she described what she was feeling through your connection, even I couldn't ignore it." "And when she came to Gryffindor Tower asking for help," Hermione added, "we all came running. House rivalries seemed pretty stupid when someone might be dying." The sound of adult voices approaching made the students tense, but it was Professor McGonagall who appeared first, her tartan robes billowing behind her as she surveyed the scene with sharp eyes. "Mr. Potter," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "perhaps you could explain why you were in the Forbidden Forest unsupervised, and why half the school appears to have mobilized for a rescue operation." Harry held up the detention slip, and McGonagall's expression grew progressively darker as she read it. "This is not Professor Kettleburn's handwriting," she said finally, "nor is it his signature." "Professor?" Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "This detention was never authorized by any faculty member," McGonagall said, her voice sharp with anger. "Someone forged this assignment to place you in danger." The implications hung heavy in the night air. Someone had deliberately sent Harry into the Forbidden Forest alone, knowing he would be vulnerable to the dangerous creatures that lived there. "Professor McGonagall," Hermione said quietly, "if someone wanted to create a situation where Harry needed rescuing, so they could swoop in and prove he still needed their protection," McGonagall finished grimly. "Yes, Miss Granger, that thought had occurred to me as well." Dumbledore arrived moments later, his blue eyes taking in the scene with what looked like calculated assessment rather than concern. "My dear boy," he said to Harry, "what are you doing out here so late?" Harry held up the forged detention slip. "Following orders that you apparently didn't give." Something flickered across Dumbledore's face. Surprise, perhaps, or frustration that his plan had gone awry. "I see. How very unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" McGonagall's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Albus, a student was placed in mortal danger by a forged detention assignment. This is far beyond unfortunate. This is a deliberate attempt to endanger a child. Now, Minerva, surely you don't think—" "I think," McGonagall interrupted, "that this situation has gone far enough. Mr. Potter, Miss Greengrass, you will come with me. The rest of you, return to your dormitories immediately." As the students began to disperse, Harry heard murmured conversations that suggested the night's events had shifted something fundamental in the school's social dynamics. Slytherins were thanking Gryffindors for their help in the rescue. Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws were discussing the magical display they'd witnessed. House rivalries seemed to have taken a back seat to the shared realization that adult authority figures might not always have their best interests at heart. In McGonagall's office, the professor paced behind her desk with controlled fury, while Harry and Daphne sat in chairs that felt more like a sanctuary than a place of discipline. "The Board of Governors will be hearing about this," McGonagall said firmly. "Forged detention assignments, students placed in mortal danger, and the manipulation of school safety protocols for personal agendas. This crosses every line of acceptable conduct for a headmaster." "Professor," Daphne said carefully, "will we be in trouble for organizing the rescue?" McGonagall's stern expression softened slightly. "Miss Greengrass, you and your fellow students showed remarkable courage and loyalty tonight. You mobilized across house lines to protect someone in danger, and you did so without regard for your own safety. Far from being in trouble, you should be commended." She moved to her desk and began writing rapidly on official-looking parchment. "I'm filing formal complaints with the Board of Governors, the Ministry's Department of Magical Education, and the International Confederation of Wizards Educational Standards Committee. What happened tonight was unconscionable." The next morning brought a very public response from Lord Greengrass in the form of a letter published in the Daily Prophet. To the wizarding community. Recent events at Hogwarts School have brought to light serious concerns about the welfare and safety of students under current administrative leadership. When my daughter's magical bond with Harry Potter alerted her to his life-threatening danger last night, she was able to mobilize students from multiple houses to mount a successful rescue operation. This incident raises troubling questions about whether detention assignments are being used as tools of manipulation rather than education. The Greengrass family calls for a full investigation into all administrative decisions that have placed students at risk. We stand firmly behind the alliance between our family and the Potter family, and we will not tolerate any further attempts to endanger these young people for political purposes. The children showed us what Hogwarts can be when houses unite for the common good. Perhaps it's time for the adults to follow their example. Cyrus Greengrass, Lord of the ancient House of Greengrass. By lunchtime, the story had spread throughout the wizarding world. Harry found himself surrounded by students from all houses who wanted to hear about the magical bond that had saved his life and brought the school together in ways that hadn't been seen in decades. "You know what's funny?" Ron said, as they sat at the Gryffindor table, watching Slytherins and Gryffindors actually having civil conversations at nearby tables. "Dumbledore tried to prove you still needed his protection, but instead, he proved you've got something better." "What's that?" Harry asked. "Us," Hermione said simply. "All of us. When you needed help, it didn't matter what houses we were in or what our families believed. We came running because that's what friends do." Harry looked across the great hall to where Daphne sat with a mixed group of Slytherins and Ravenclaws, all of them discussing the previous night's events with animated enthusiasm. When their eyes met, he felt the magical bond hum with warm contentment. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Not because of his fame or his destiny, but because he'd found people who chose to stand with him regardless of the consequences. And that, he realized, was more powerful than any magic Dumbledore could ever wield. Chapter 12. Choices Made, Futures Forged. The end of their first year at Hogwarts arrived with the kind of warm June sunshine that made the castle grounds feel more like home than Harry had ever imagined possible. As he packed his trunk in the Gryffindor dormitory, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of Ron's scattered belongings and Neville's carefully organized plant specimens, Harry felt a strange mixture of anticipation and contentment. "Still can't believe you're spending the summer with the Greengrass family," Ron said, folding his Chudley Cannons poster with exaggerated care. "I mean, it's brilliant that you won't be stuck with the Dursleys, but Slytherins, Harry." "They're good people, Ron," Harry replied patiently. They'd had this conversation several times over the past weeks, ever since Lord Greengrass had formally invited Harry to spend the holidays at Greengrass Manor. "Besides, Daphne will be there." "Right, your girlfriend," Ron said, with a grin that suggested he was still getting used to the idea. "The one who can sense when you're in mortal danger and mobilize half the school to rescue you." "Among other things," Harry said dryly, though he couldn't help smiling at the memory of that night in the Forbidden Forest. The incident had become legendary among the students, especially after the magical bond's protective display had been witnessed by so many people. The past month had brought changes to Hogwarts that no one could have anticipated at the beginning of the year. Dumbledore's resignation had been announced quietly, with the official explanation being his desire to pursue other educational opportunities. Everyone knew the real reason. The Board of Governors' investigation had found serious violations of student welfare protocols, and public pressure had made his position untenable. Professor McGonagall's appointment as interim headmaster had been met with overwhelming approval from students and faculty alike. Her first official act had been to establish new guidelines for student safety and inter-house cooperation, many of which had been suggested by the students themselves after witnessing the unity that had emerged during Harry's rescue. "Mr. Potter!" Professor McGonagall's voice interrupted his packing. She stood in the dormitory doorway with her usual stern expression, but Harry had learned to recognize the warmth that lurked beneath her professional demeanor. "A word, if you please." Harry followed her to an empty classroom, wondering if he was in trouble for some final week transgression he'd forgotten about. But McGonagall's expression was thoughtful rather than disapproving. "I wanted to speak with you before you depart for the summer," she said, settling behind the desk with the familiar authority that had made her such a natural choice for headmaster. "This year has been extraordinary in many ways." "That's one word for it," Harry said with a slight smile. "Indeed." McGonagall's lips twitched with what might have been amusement. "Mr. Potter, when you arrived at Hogwarts, I expected to see your father's recklessness and your mother's brilliance. What I didn't expect was to see someone so young display such mature judgment in the face of manipulation and pressure." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I had help, Professor. Daphne, Ron, Hermione, even some of the Slytherins. I couldn't have managed any of it alone." "Which is precisely my point," McGonagall said. "You understood instinctively that strength comes from connection, not isolation. That's a lesson many adults never learn." She paused, studying his face with sharp eyes. "Your parents would be very proud of the choices you've made this year." The words hit Harry with unexpected force. After months of learning how his life had been manipulated and planned by others, hearing that his parents would approve of his own choices felt like absolution. "Thank you, Professor," he said quietly. "See that you continue to make them proud," McGonagall replied. "And Mr. Potter, have a wonderful summer with the Greengrass family. I believe you'll find they have much to teach you about balancing tradition with progress." The Hogwarts Express journey home was different from the one that had brought them to school in September. Harry found himself in a compartment with not only Ron and Hermione, but also Daphne, Neville, and surprisingly, several other students from different houses who had become friends through the inter-house study groups that had formed after the forest incident. "It's strange," Hermione mused as they watched the Scottish countryside roll past the windows. When we started this year, the idea of Slytherins and Gryffindors being friends seemed impossible. Now look at us. Turns out we all want pretty much the same things, said Susan Bones, a Hufflepuff who'd become one of Daphne's closest friends. Safety, fairness, and the chance to make our own choices about our futures. Speaking of futures, Daphne said, reaching into her bag to pull out an official-looking scroll. My parents wanted me to show you this, Harry. Harry unrolled the parchment to find an elaborately decorated document written in formal legal language. At the bottom were two signatures, Lord Greengrass and Lady Greengrass, along with space for two more. A formal acceptance ceremony, Daphne explained, as the other students leaned in curiously. If we both sign this at the summer solstice, it officially transforms the marriage contract from a family obligation into a personal choice. We're not required to do it, but it would make it clear that we're choosing each other freely, Harry finished, not being forced together by ancient magic or family politics. Exactly. Daphne's blue eyes were serious as she met his gaze. What do you think? Harry looked around the compartment at their friends, Ron and Hermione, who'd stood by him despite their initial doubts, Neville, who'd found his own courage through supporting others, Susan and the other students who'd shown that house unity was possible when people chose to see beyond old prejudices. These were the witnesses he'd want for something so important. I think, Harry said slowly, that I'd like our friends to be there when we make that choice official. All of us? Ron asked, looking surprised. All of you, Daphne confirmed with a warm smile. You're the ones who helped us understand that real strength comes from the people who choose to stand with you. The ceremony at Greengrass Manor 3 weeks later was nothing like Harry had expected. Instead of the formal, intimidating affair he'd imagined, it felt more like a celebration among friends. The Weasley family had been invited, along with Hermione's parents and several other families who'd become allies throughout the year's events. The manor itself was beautiful, in a way that spoke of centuries of careful stewardship rather than ostentatious display. Gardens filled with white roses surrounded a house that managed to be both grand and welcoming, and Harry found himself immediately comfortable in ways he'd never experienced at Privet Drive. Nervous? Daphne asked, as they stood together in the garden where the ceremony would take place. She wore robes of deep blue that brought out her eyes, and her hair was arranged with small white flowers that Harry suspected had been grown specifically for the occasion. Terrified, Harry admitted with a smile. But the good kind of terrified. The kind that means you're about to do something important. Good, Daphne said, reaching for his hand. Because I think what we're doing here is the most important thing either of us will ever do. Not the magic, not the politics. The choice to build something together. The ceremony itself was surprisingly simple. Lord and Lady Greengrass served as witnesses, along with Professor McGonagall, who'd accepted an invitation to attend in her new capacity as headmaster. Harry and Daphne each read brief statements they'd written, declaring their intention to honor the bond their fathers had created while making it their own choice rather than an inherited obligation. I choose Daphne Greengrass, Harry said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered friends and family. Not because ancient magic compels me, but because she sees me as Harry rather than the boy who lived. Because she's brave enough to stand up to bullies and wise enough to value loyalty over politics. Because with her, I'm not just surviving, I'm living. I choose Harry Potter, Daphne replied, her own voice steady and sure. Not because our families arranged it, but because he's taught me that honor means protecting the people you care about, even when it costs you everything. Because he chooses to see the best in people regardless of their house or blood status. Because with him, I'm not just fulfilling expectations, I'm becoming who I want to be. When they signed the document together, The magical bond between them flared to visible life one more time. But instead of the protective golden threads they'd seen in moments of danger, this time the magic manifested as soft, warm light that seemed to dance around them like living joy. "Well," Ron said, as the light faded and the gathered witnesses erupted in applause, "that was brilliant. But could you two try not to glow every time you get romantic? Some of us are trying to eat." The laughter that followed felt like the perfect punctuation to a year that had started with secrets and manipulation, but ended with honest choice and genuine community. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and their friends gradually departed for their own homes, Harry and Daphne found themselves alone in the garden where it had all taken place. The sun was setting behind the ancient oak trees that bordered the manor grounds, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. "No regrets?" Daphne asked, settling beside him on the stone bench where they'd shared so many conversations over the past weeks. "Only one," Harry said seriously. Daphne's eyebrows rose in concern. "What's that?" "That it took us so long to get here," Harry replied with a smile. "That we had to go through all the manipulation and politics and fear before we found our way to this." "Maybe that's what made it real," Daphne suggested thoughtfully. "If it had been easy, if everyone had just accepted our choice from the beginning, would we have been sure we were making it for the right reasons?" Harry considered this as he watched the last light fade from the sky. "You think the struggle made us stronger?" "I think the struggle made us sure," Daphne corrected. "Sure that we were choosing each other for who we are, not who others expected us to be." She leaned against his shoulder, and Harry felt the familiar warmth of their bond settle into something deeper and more permanent than magic. This was choice, freely given and freely accepted. This was partnership built on trust and mutual respect, rather than obligation or expectation. "So what happens now?" Harry asked. "We go back to Hogwarts in September, finish our education, deal with whatever new challenges come up." "We face them together," Daphne said simply. "Whatever comes, good or bad, magical or mundane, we face it as partners." Harry turned to look at her in the gathering dusk, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the warmth in her blue eyes. "Partners," he agreed. When he kissed her, it felt like a promise. Not the desperate, interrupted kiss they'd shared in the astronomy tower, but something deeper and more certain. The magical bond between them pulsed with soft golden light, but Harry barely noticed. What mattered was the girl in his arms, the choice they'd made together, and the future they would build as equals and allies. As they broke apart, both of them smiling in the darkness, Harry felt something settle in his chest that he'd been looking for his entire life without knowing it. He had a home now, not just a place to sleep, but a person who chose to stand with him regardless of the consequences. He had friends who valued loyalty over politics, and family who saw him as himself rather than a symbol or weapon. Most importantly, he had the freedom to choose his own path forward, whatever challenges the future might bring, and Harry was realistic enough to know there would be challenges. He would face them as Harry Potter, not as the boy who lived, or as anyone else's vision of who he should be. "Ready to go plan our future?" Daphne asked, standing and extending her hand to help him up. "With you?" Harry said, taking her hand and feeling the familiar spark of connection that had nothing to do with ancient magic and everything to do with choice. "I'm ready for anything." They walked back toward the manor house together, their hands intertwined and their magical bond humming with quiet contentment. Behind them, the garden where they'd chosen each other freely glowed softly in the starlight, as if the magic itself approved of what they'd built together. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. And for the first time in his life,